In the long years before the word revolution ever drifted across the Atlantic, life in the 13 American colonies moved at a slow and familiar pace. Mornings began with light filtering through wooden shutters, roosters calling across small farms, and the steady rhythm of work that tied families to land, water, and weather. Days unfolded predictably, shaped more by seasons than by politics, and most people expected tomorrow to look very much like today. Small towns rested along dirt roads and rivers, their buildings simple and close together. A meeting house or church often stood at the center, its bell marking time more reliably than any clock. Nearby, a tavern offered warmth, conversation, and news from passing travelers. These places were not centers of rebellion, but of routine. People gathered to talk about crops, trade, marriages, births, and deaths, rarely imagining that history was quietly gathering around them. On farms, families worked together from sunrise to dusk. Children learned their tasks early, helping in fields, barns, and kitchens. Life demanded effort, but it also offered stability. A good harvest meant security through winter, and neighbors depended on one another in times of illness or loss. Loyalty was local first, rooted in family and community rather than distant authority. In port cities like Boston, New York, and Charleston, the sound of water against wooden docks blended with voices calling out cargo lists and prices. Ships arrived from across the ocean, bringing cloth, tools, tea, and letters from England. The empire felt real here, but still far away. British flags fluttered above harbors, yet daily life remained firmly colonial, shaped by trade, habit, and personal ambition. Most colonists thought of themselves as British subjects. The king was a distant figure, more symbol than presence, and parliament was something read about, not felt. Laws existed, but they rarely intruded into ordinary routines. As long as trade flowed and taxes remained manageable, there was little reason to question the larger system holding everything together. Churches played a steady role in colonial life, offering comfort, moral guidance, and a shared sense of meaning. Sundays slowed the week, drawing families together in quiet reflection. Sermons spoke of duty, patience, and order, reinforcing the idea that the world had its proper place and rhythm. Change, when it came, was expected to be slow and deliberate. At night, homes settled into silence broken only by wind, insects, or distant animals. Candles flickered as families read aloud, mended clothing, or simply rested from the day's labor. These evenings carried no sense of approaching upheaval. Instead, they were filled with the calm belief that life, though demanding, was predictable and secure. The idea of rebellion did not yet exist in any meaningful way. There were complaints, of course, about prices or shortages or local disputes, but they were personal, not political. Few people imagined challenging an empire. Fewer still believed they were capable of doing so. Stability felt permanent, and permanence felt comforting. Yet beneath this calm surface, habits were forming that would later matter deeply. Colonists were used to managing their own affairs, solving problems locally, and relying on neighbors rather than distant officials. Independence was not a goal, but it was becoming a skill practiced quietly, day after ordinary day. This was the world before the storm, a place of routine and reassurance. Life moved gently forward, unaware that its very calmness was shaping people who would one day face extraordinary change, carrying familiar rhythms into an unfamiliar future. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the British Crown governed the American colonies with a light but steady hand, rarely seen yet always present. Authority flowed outward from London through paperwork, tradition, and expectation rather than daily force. For most colonists, imperial power felt like background weather, shaping conditions without demanding attention. Ships arrived, laws existed, and officials held titles, but ordinary lives continued uninterrupted. The empire did not shout its presence. It whispered through routines, customs, and assumptions that quietly framed what was possible, allowed, and expected in colonial life. This subtle influence felt natural, inherited, unquestioned, and comfortably familiar too. Governance in the colonies operated through layers that seemed orderly and distant. Royal governors represented the king, yet most decisions were handled locally by assemblies and councils. Laws arrived slowly, often adapted to colonial realities before enforcement. Trade rules guided what could be bought and sold, shaping ports and merchants gently over time. These systems created structure without urgency, allowing colonists to feel secure while remaining connected to a greater empire that promised stability, protection, and prosperity without constant supervision. It was power expressed through patience, tradition, and trust, rather than fear or force in everyday colonial affairs and governance. British military presence existed mostly at the edges of awareness. Soldiers were stationed to defend borders and trade routes, not to police daily behavior. Their red coats symbolized security more than control, especially after earlier wars had ended. Protection felt reassuring, a promise that danger would be kept far away. Yet even protection carries weight. Armies require funding, coordination, and obedience, and these quiet necessities slowly tighten the relationship between colony and crown. This balance remained calm for years, rarely questioned, slowly shaping expectations about authority, safety, and responsibility within an expanding imperial system that valued order and continuity globally. Trade connected the colonies to Britain more consistently than any official decree. Merchants followed regulations that benefited the empire, sending raw materials outward and receiving finished goods in return. This arrangement felt normal, even helpful, providing markets and opportunity. Over time, however, limits became noticeable. Certain paths were encouraged, others quietly blocked. Choice narrowed without announcement, and dependence grew invisibly, like roots spreading beneath soil, unnoticed until movement became difficult. This economic rhythm shaped daily decisions, linking household labor to distant policies few fully understood. It felt stable, dependable, and quietly restrictive at the same time for many colonists everywhere. The British Crown did not intend immediate conflict. Its systems were designed for efficiency, profit, and order across vast distances. From London, the colonies were pieces within a larger design, valuable but manageable. From America, that design felt gentle and far away. This imbalance of perspective mattered. Power that feels distant often goes unquestioned, yet distance can also soften loyalty, turning authority into abstraction rather than personal bond. In this space between presence and absence, curiosity quietly stirred, unnoticed, waiting for circumstances to give it shape. The empire felt secure, yet subtly incomplete in colonial minds over time and memory. Daily interaction with imperial authority often appeared through paperwork rather than presence. Licenses, shipping manifests, customs forms, and official stamps carried the crown's authority in ink and wax. These documents traveled more frequently than soldiers, shaping commerce and behavior through compliance instead of confrontation. Colonists learned to navigate rules with quiet efficiency, adjusting rather than resisting. The system rewarded cooperation, encouraging people to see regulation as part of ordinary life. This administrative web spread evenly, calm and methodical, reinforcing the sense that order was natural and that the empire functioned best when unnoticed and unchallenged by those living within it. Governors served as visible symbols of royal power, yet their influence depended on cooperation. They hosted meetings, signed proclamations, and represented imperial interests while relying heavily on local support. Many colonists viewed them as administrators rather than rulers, distant figures who followed procedure more than passion. This softened perception made authority feel negotiable, flexible, and human. Disagreements occurred, but they remained contained within formal language and familiar channels. Conflict stayed theoretical, managed through discussion and delay. The system encouraged patience, teaching colonists that waiting was often easier than resisting, and compromise was safer than challenge. Imperial protection extended beyond soldiers and ships into ideas of belonging. Being part of the British Empire meant shared identity, shared enemies, and shared pride in global strength. Colonists benefited from this connection, enjoying access to trade networks and security guarantees. This relationship felt mutual, even generous. Few questioned its fairness because it seemed to function smoothly. Loyalty formed quietly through benefit rather than demand. The crown appeared as a distant guardian, offering shelter rather than control, and this perception allowed affection and trust to grow slowly, untested by hardship or direct confrontation. Yet systems that function smoothly can also hide imbalance. Decisions made in London reflected priorities far removed from colonial realities. Distance delayed understanding, and understanding shaped policy. Colonists adapted without complaint because adaptation was familiar. Still, small frustrations accumulated, rarely spoken aloud. The structure remained calm, but pressure gathered in subtle ways. Like water held behind a wall, the force was not yet visible. It existed only as weight, held in place by routine, comfort, and the belief that the system, as it always had, would continue unchanged. At this stage, the reach of the British Crown felt secure and unquestioned, woven gently into daily life. Authority existed without urgency, protection without fear, and control without confrontation. The balance held steady, almost peaceful. Few imagined it could shift. Fewer still imagined it would matter. Yet beneath the calm surface, systems were quietly teaching people how to notice limits, how to feel pressure, and how to live within rules that one day might no longer feel invisible. When the French and Indian War finally came to an end, relief settled gently across the British Empire. The long struggle had been exhausting, stretching across forests, rivers, and distant frontiers. Britain emerged victorious, its rivals pushed back, its territory expanded. For the colonies, the war's end felt like a deep exhale after years of uncertainty. Borders seemed safer, trade routes more secure, and the threat of invasion faded quietly into memory. Peace returned not with celebration, but with a sense of normalcy slowly reclaiming daily life once again. Yet victory carried a weight that was not immediately visible. The war had been expensive beyond measure. Ships, soldiers, weapons, and supplies had drained Britain's treasury, leaving behind a vast and uncomfortable debt. From London's perspective, the solution seemed logical. The colonies had benefited from the war's outcome, gaining security and land. It felt reasonable that they should help pay for the protection they enjoyed. This idea arrived gently, framed as responsibility rather than punishment, and it did not initially feel threatening. In the colonies, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Farms returned to full production, ports welcomed ships, and towns repaired what little damage the war had left behind. Few people thought deeply about imperial finances or distant political calculations. Peace meant stability, and stability encouraged rest. The memory of conflict faded quickly, replaced by the comfort of routine. It seemed natural to believe that the empire, now stronger than before, would loosen its grip and allow prosperity to grow quietly across its lands. Instead, attention slowly turned inward. Britain began looking more closely at its colonies, not as distant outposts, but as active parts of a system that required maintenance. New soldiers remained stationed in North America, not to fight, but to guard borders and enforce order. Their presence felt subtle at first, almost reassuring. Redcoats became a more common sight, blending into landscapes that had grown used to occasional military movement during wartime. Oversight increased in ways that felt administrative rather than aggressive. Officials counted, recorded, and reported with renewed interest. Trade was observed more carefully, customs more thoroughly enforced. Paperwork grew thicker, procedures more precise. None of this caused immediate outrage. It arrived quietly, wrapped in explanations about efficiency and fairness. Most colonists adjusted without complaint, assuming these changes were temporary, a lingering effect of war that would soon fade. Taxes followed, modest at first, introduced as necessary contributions to a shared burden. They were explained calmly, justified with logic that was difficult to dispute. Britain had protected the colonies, Britain had won the war, and now Britain needed help. Many colonists accepted this reasoning without resistance. The amount seemed manageable, and the idea of contributing to imperial stability felt familiar. Still, the act of paying felt different than before. It carried a new awareness of obligation. What changed was not hardship, but attention. Colonists began noticing decisions that had once gone unseen. They became more aware of rules, more conscious of authority, more alert to the direction of power. Nothing dramatic occurred. No protests filled the streets, no speeches echoed through town squares. Instead, a quiet awareness settled in, subtle and persistent. Peace no longer felt entirely weightless. It carried expectations that rested unevenly across the empire. For Britain, these measures felt necessary and responsible. For the colonies, they felt new. The relationship had shifted slightly, not enough to alarm, but enough to be felt. The empire's gaze lingered longer, its hand pressed a little more firmly. This was not oppression, but adjustment. Still, adjustment can change perception, and perception shapes feeling. What had once seemed distant now felt closer, more involved in everyday life. Late at night, as homes settled into silence, these changes were rarely discussed aloud. They lived instead in passing thoughts and quiet conversations. People wondered briefly what peace truly meant now. They considered whether safety always required sacrifice and whether victory always brought freedom. These questions did not demand answers yet. They simply existed, floating gently through the calm, waiting for a moment when they might matter more than comfort. The war was over, but its effects continued to unfold. Britain stood stronger, the colonies more secure, yet something intangible had shifted. Peace had not erased tension, it had rearranged it. The empire moved forward, confident and calculating, while the colonies followed, attentive but uncertain. This moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, became the hinge of history where calm slowly leaned toward change without anyone fully realizing it yet. The changes did not arrive with shouting or sudden force. They came folded into paper, stamped with ink, and explained in careful language. After the war, Britain's need for money turned into policy, and policy slowly entered colonial life. The Sugar Act adjusted duties on imported goods, especially those that sweetened daily routines. The Stamp Act followed, placing a small tax on paper used for newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and letters. These were ordinary objects, part of everyday life, and that was precisely why they mattered. At first, the amount seemed minor. A stamp here, a duty there. No single tax threatened survival or comfort, yet their presence felt different from previous regulations. These were not distant trade rules affecting merchants alone. They touched lawyers, printers, shopkeepers, sailors, and farmers alike. Paper passed through many hands, and now each exchange carried a quiet reminder of authority. The empire was no longer only shaping trade. It was marking daily life itself. People noticed this change slowly. A printer paused before publishing a page. A merchant counted costs more carefully. A farmer listened as a neighbor explained why a document now required a stamp. These moments did not spark anger immediately. Instead, they produced a mild discomfort, a sense that something familiar had been altered. Routine had gained a price, and that price invited attention. What unsettled many colonists was not the cost, but the principle. Taxes were being decided far away by people they had never met. For years, local assemblies had handled internal matters. Now Parliament spoke directly into colonial pockets. The voice was polite, reasonable, and firm. It asked for contribution, not obedience, yet the distinction felt thin. Payment implied acceptance, and acceptance carried meaning beyond money. Conversations began to change tone. In taverns and homes, people spoke more carefully about laws and fairness. They did not shout. They questioned. Why here and why now? Why paper and why without local consent? These were not demands for rebellion, but reflections shaped by curiosity and concern. The questions lingered longer than the answers. The Stamp Act, in particular, carried symbolic weight. Paper was the medium of ideas, agreements, and identity. Newspapers shaped opinion. Legal papers confirmed ownership and rights. Letters connected families across distance. To tax, these things felt personal, even intimate. It was as though the empire had placed its mark on communication itself, quietly asserting presence in the most ordinary exchanges. Still, daily life continued. Fields were worked, ships unloaded, children taught. No one stopped living because of a stamp. This made the tension more subtle. Anger did not roar. It rested beneath the surface, growing familiar, settling into awareness. People adapted while remembering that adaptation had been required. Protests, when they appeared, were restrained at first. Meetings were organized. Petitions were written. Words were chosen carefully, respectful but firm. Colonists expressed loyalty even as they questioned policy. They wanted to be heard, not to break away. Resistance took the form of thought rather than action, and thought spread quietly. What made the pressure feel heavier was its direction. Taxes moved inward, touching private spaces rather than distant markets. Oversight felt closer, more attentive. The empire seemed to be watching, counting, and recording. This attention did not feel hostile, but it felt new. Being noticed can be unsettling when one is used to moving freely. Some people paid without complaint, believing the situation would pass. Others felt a quiet tightening in their chest, an unease they could not fully explain. It was not fear, but awareness. A realization that comfort depended on decisions made elsewhere, and that those decisions might continue. Late at night, these thoughts drifted through quiet rooms. People wondered how much pressure it truly took before something changed. They considered why small taxes felt heavier than larger ones ever had. Perhaps it was because these marks on paper left traces in the mind, reminding people of limits they had not known before. Nothing had broken yet. Loyalty still existed, strong and sincere, but it had begun to stretch just slightly. The empire had asked for more, and in doing so it had invited reflection. Calm remained, but beneath it, something thoughtful and restless had begun to form, waiting patiently for what might come next. Ideas rarely announced themselves with noise. They arrived softly, carried by voices, pages, and moments of shared attention. In the colonies, as new laws settled into daily life, thought began to move in quiet ways. Taverns became more than places of rest. Pamphlets became more than paper. Conversation itself began to carry a different weight, gentle but persistent, like a current beneath still water. Taverns were warm spaces where time slowed. Candles burned low, mugs rested on rough tables, and strangers became familiar through repeated meetings. Here, news traveled without urgency. A story from Boston might arrive weeks late, reshaped by memory and opinion. No one demanded certainty. What mattered was the act of sharing, of listening, of wondering together. Words moved freely in these rooms, drifting from table to table, settling into thought. Pamphlets played a quieter role, yet a powerful one. They were small, affordable, and easy to pass along. A single page could move through many hands, read aloud, discussed, and folded away for later. These writings did not shout for revolution. They asked questions. They explored fairness, rights, and history. They invited readers to pause and think, not to act immediately, but to reconsider what they believed they already understood. Rumors traveled alongside printed words. A comment overheard at a dock. A remark repeated on a road. Each retelling softened facts and sharpened feelings. Accuracy mattered less than meaning. Stories carried emotion more than detail, shaping perception through tone rather than proof. In this way, ideas spread not as commands but as impressions, gradually shaping how people felt about authority and themselves. What made these exchanges powerful was their intimacy. Ideas were not imposed from above. They were shared among equals. A neighbor spoke to a neighbor. A friend read to a friend. This made thought feel personal rather than political. It allowed curiosity to grow without fear. People could explore ideas privately before ever expressing them aloud, letting meaning settle at its own pace. Most conversations remained calm. There was no single voice guiding them, no unified direction. Some people defended British authority, others questioned it gently. Many listened without choosing sides. This lack of urgency created space. Without pressure to decide, thought deepened. Reflection replaced reaction, and reflection can be quietly transformative. The power of these ideas lay in repetition. A question heard once might be ignored. Heard again, it lingered. Over time, familiar phrases began to sound different. Concepts like representation, consent, and fairness took on new clarity. They were no longer abstract. They connected to taxes paid, papers stamped, and choices limited. Meaning emerged slowly, shaped by lived experience. Importantly, this exchange of ideas did not feel dangerous at first. It felt thoughtful, even comforting. People enjoyed the sense of understanding something larger than themselves. They felt connected through shared inquiry. There was pleasure in discussion, in recognizing that others felt the same quiet unease. This shared awareness reduced isolation, making concern feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Authorities noticed little of this at first. Conversations leave no record. Pamphlets vanish into pockets and shelves. Thought is difficult to measure. That was its strength. Ideas moved without drawing attention, crossing boundaries without resistance. They did not challenge power directly. They questioned it internally, where change often begins. Late at night, when taverns emptied and homes grew quiet, these ideas continued their work. People lay awake, replaying conversations, rereading lines, considering possibilities. They did not imagine rebellion. They imagined fairness. They imagined being heard. They imagined a future that felt more balanced, more respectful, more their own. Words traveled faster than armies because they required no supply lines. They needed only attention. An idea shared quietly could reshape perception without leaving a trace. This made it powerful and unsettling, though few recognized it yet. Thought was becoming movement, even if no one called it that. The colonies remained calm on the surface. No banners flew, no shots rang out. Yet beneath that calm, a new language was forming. It spoke softly, patiently, and with growing confidence. Revolution had not begun in action, but in understanding. And understanding, once awakened, rarely returns to sleep unchanged. By the winter of 1770, the air in Boston carried a tension that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. British soldiers had been stationed in the city for some time. Their presence meant to maintain order, not provoke unrest. They walked the streets in red coats, stood guard near customs houses, and became part of the daily scenery. Most days passed quietly. People learned to move around one another, sharing narrow streets with cautious familiarity, each side aware, neither fully comfortable. On a cold March evening, that fragile balance began to strain. Snow lay packed along the streets, and darkness arrived early. A small group gathered near a British sentry, voices raised but not yet angry. Words were exchanged, sharp but uncertain. No one planned violence. No one expected history to step forward. The moment grew from irritation rather than intention, shaped by accumulated pressure rather than sudden rage. More soldiers arrived, responding to noise and confusion. The crowd grew as well, drawn by curiosity and emotion. Sounds echoed between buildings, boots on stone, breath in cold air, fragments of speech overlapping. The situation remained unsettled, not explosive. People stood close, watching, waiting, unsure of what they were waiting for. Tension thickened, yet still held. Then, in a brief and irreversible moment, shots were fired. The sound cut through the night, sharp and startling. When it ended, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. The violence was sudden, contained, and over almost as quickly as it began. Silence followed, heavy and stunned. The city seemed to pause, as if unsure how to respond to what had just occurred. News spread quickly, though details blurred. Some spoke of provocation. Others spoke of brutality. The truth sat somewhere in between, complex and uncomfortable. This was not a battle, not a planned attack. It was confusion, fear, and reaction compressed into seconds. That made it harder to understand and easier to feel. In the days that followed, Boston did not erupt. Instead, it grew quiet. Funerals were held, crowds walked slowly through the streets. Reflection replaced outrage. The event was discussed carefully, weighed and reweighed in conversation. People wanted meaning, not chaos. They wanted to know what this moment represented. The soldiers were arrested and put on trial, a deliberate choice meant to preserve order and fairness. This decision mattered. It showed restraint, an effort to prevent emotion from overtaking principle. The law still functioned. Society had not collapsed, yet something had changed. Trust had been shaken, and once shaken, it does not return easily. What made the event powerful was not its scale, but its symbolism. Blood had been spilled between subjects and soldiers in a city street. The distance between ruler and ruled felt smaller now, closer, more personal. Violence had entered the story briefly but unmistakably. It could no longer be imagined away. Illustrations and accounts circulated, shaping perception as much as fact. Some portrayed the soldiers as aggressors, others as threatened men. Images lingered in the mind longer than explanations. They gave the event a life beyond Boston, allowing people far away to feel connected to a night they had not witnessed. Yet even as the story spread, the tone remained restrained. This was not a call to arms. It was a moment of reckoning. People asked themselves what it meant to live under protection that could turn deadly. They wondered how tension could be managed before it reached such a point again. For many, the event confirmed feelings they had struggled to define. It gave shape to unease, turning abstract concern into concrete memory. For others, it was a warning about the danger of disorder, a reminder of how quickly situations could spiral beyond control. Both interpretations existed side by side, unresolved. As time passed, the city resumed its rhythm. Shops opened, ships sailed. Life continued, though with a subtle difference. Awareness lingered. People moved through familiar streets knowing that something irreversible had occurred there. The calm had been broken, even if only briefly. The Boston Massacre did not begin a war. It did not end loyalty overnight. Instead, it marked a boundary crossed, a moment when tension became visible. Afterward, reflection deepened. Questions grew heavier. The night passed, but its echo remained, quietly reshaping how the colonies understood power, protection, and the fragile line between peace and conflict. On a cold December night in 1773, Boston Harbor lay quiet beneath the dark sky. The water moved gently against the docks, indifferent to the tension carried by those who gathered nearby. There were no drums, no shouted commands, no clash of weapons. What unfolded that night was not chaos, but intention shaped by restraint. It was an act designed to be seen, remembered, and understood without spilling blood. For months, tea had become more than a drink. It had turned into a symbol, light enough to stir with a spoon, heavy enough to carry meaning. British policies had made it a reminder of control, a small luxury bound tightly to authority. Refusing it quietly had already become common, but now something more deliberate was forming. Words had traveled, meetings had been held, and decisions had been weighed carefully. Action, when it came, would speak softly but clearly. Men moved through the streets dressed in disguise, not to hide their faces from history, but to shift the focus away from individuals. This was not about names or personal glory. It was about message. Their steps were measured, their voices low. The city slept as they approached the ships anchored in the harbor, vessels heavy with chests of tea waiting to be unloaded. The night air carried the scent of salt and wood. Lantern light flickered briefly, then dimmed. One by one, the men climbed aboard the ships. There was no resistance. No guards were harmed. No property was damaged beyond what had been chosen deliberately. Chests were opened and lifted, then tipped into the water. Tea spilled into the harbor, dark shapes disappearing beneath the surface, swallowed silently by the cold sea. The act unfolded methodically, almost calmly. Each movement felt practiced, though nothing like this had happened before. There was purpose in the restraint. No tea was taken, nothing else was touched. This was not theft, not destruction born of anger. It was a statement carefully limited in scope, designed to communicate without inviting chaos. Silence defined the moment. The water absorbed the tea without sound, and the night watched without protest. From shore, few witnessed the event directly, yet even unseen, its meaning was already traveling. By morning, the harbor would carry the evidence, and the city would awaken to the realization that something extraordinary had occurred. Why tea and not soldiers? The answer lay in intention. Violence would have narrowed the message, turning it into fear and retaliation. Tea instead spoke of choice. It rejected policy rather than people. It challenged authority without denying humanity. This distinction mattered deeply to those involved. They did not seek war. They sought to be heard. When daylight arrived, the harbor told the story. Tea leaves floated where commerce once moved freely. The image was unmistakable, simple enough to be understood without explanation. It traveled quickly, carried by word and ink, transforming a quiet night into a shared moment of recognition across the colonies. Reactions varied. Some felt pride, others worry. Many felt a mix of both. The act was bold, yet controlled. It crossed a line, but did so deliberately, signaling resolve without surrendering to rage. It suggested that resistance could be thoughtful, even restrained, and still carry weight. British authorities were not silent for long. To them, this was destruction of property, a direct challenge that demanded response. Yet even in that response, the nature of the act mattered. No blood had been spilled. No violence could be punished directly. The question became one of authority and consequence, not immediate retaliation. For colonists, the night lingered in the imagination. The image of tea sinking into dark water became a symbol of choice made collectively. It represented a shift from quiet disagreement to visible defiance, still wrapped in restraint. Resistance was no longer only spoken. It had taken form, gentle yet unmistakable. The Boston Tea Party did not erupt into celebration. It settled into reflection. People wondered what would follow, how the empire would respond, and whether the balance could still be restored. Yet beneath those questions lay a new certainty. Action had been taken, and it had been deliberate. In the quiet that followed, the harbor returned to calm. The water moved as it always had, carrying ships and stories onward. But something had changed. Defiance had found a language that did not rely on violence. It spoke through symbolism, patience, and clarity. In that language, resistance began to feel less like a reaction and more like an identity, forming quietly, steadily, and with intention. The night of the Boston Tea Party left more than floating tea leaves behind. Across the ocean, in the quiet halls of London, authorities considered what had happened, weighing principle against precedent. The destruction of property was undeniable, even if no lives had been taken. Calm, measured discussions led to decisions that would ripple through the colonies, tightening the threads of control that had already begun to fray. The empire moved deliberately, confident that order could be restored with law rather than violence. In the months that followed, Parliament enacted a series of measures that would later be called the Intolerable Acts. Each law was written with precision, aimed at asserting authority while maintaining the appearance of fairness. The port of Boston was closed until restitution could be made. Local governments faced restrictions, limiting power that had once belonged to colonial assemblies. Judges were appointed rather than elected, shifting influence toward representatives of the crown. The measures were not cruel in intention, but firm in application. Authority had spoken, and it expected to be heard. From the perspective of Boston, these acts felt weighty and deliberate. The city moved beneath a new shadow of oversight. Ships waited in empty harbors. Town meetings became cautious, as if every word might be examined. Merchants calculated losses. Families discussed what steps could be taken, knowing that small actions mattered more than ever. Daily life continued, but with subtle hesitation. Streets once filled with conversation now carried an undertone of vigilance. The empire was close, present in ways that had previously existed only at a distance. Colonists, for the most part, did not respond with open hostility. There was no rush to arms. Instead, reflection deepened. People began to consider the balance between obedience and principle. They understood that law and loyalty were intertwined, and that missteps could have lasting consequences. This awareness carried weight, not anger. The population felt pressure, yet it was almost academic, observed as a situation to be understood rather than a fire to be fought. The intolerable acts revealed the limits of control. Laws could govern trade and assembly. They could restrict movement and decision-making. They could threaten punishment for defiance. Yet authority could not compel belief, and loyalty is rarely purchased by decree alone. The measures served as a quiet reminder of the empire's power, but also its distance. Enforcement was possible, but hearts and minds remained beyond reach. For many colonists, the laws invited reflection rather than rebellion. Conversations shifted from what had been done to what might be endured. Citizens questioned whether submission could ever restore trust, or whether compliance would erode identity over time. These questions lingered quietly in homes, taverns, and offices, shaping thought without erupting into action. Curiosity and concern mingled, creating a fertile ground for ideas that had long circulated in pamphlets and tavern talks. The calm narration of events, if observed closely, contrasted with the growing tension beneath. Streets appeared ordinary, shops opened as usual, and families continued routines. Yet subtle changes shaped behavior. Merchants documented shipments meticulously, citizens attended meetings with heightened awareness, and neighbors watched one another with discreet caution. Authority had pressed, and the response was careful, deliberate, and thoughtful. This period demonstrated the complexity of power. Control was extended, rules were enforced, and expectations became explicit. Still, influence could not be demanded where trust was absent. The empire's hand reached further, but each extension reminded colonists of the distance between enforcement and understanding. A law could close a harbor, but it could not close minds. A restriction could limit a meeting, but it could not limit thought. As nights passed, Boston adjusted to its new reality. Ships floated silently at the docks, and the harbor reflected moonlight as if untouched by the weight of history. Streets echoed faintly with conversation, quieter than before. Citizens moved carefully, balancing caution with daily necessity. The city had changed, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. The intolerable acts did not incite immediate rebellion, yet they marked a turning point. Authority had pushed deliberately, and the push was felt. People sensed the empire's presence more acutely, measuring its reach, questioning its purpose, and quietly contemplating limits. Control had been asserted, but loyalty had not been restored. The balance had shifted, setting the stage for reflection, organization, and the next quiet steps toward resistance that would define the colony's unfolding identity. By the fall of 1774, the colonies found themselves at a delicate crossroads. Tensions had been growing quietly for years, punctuated by moments of visible unrest and subtle discontent. In Philadelphia, men began to gather from distant towns and cities, bringing with them not muskets or banners, but ideas, concerns, and questions. They traveled slowly, often on horseback or in carriages, over roads that twisted through forests and fields. Their mission was not to fight, but to deliberate, to understand what it meant to live under new restrictions and what steps, if any, should be taken in response. The delegates arrived with caution. Some were seasoned leaders familiar with governance and diplomacy. Others were local figures, respected in their communities but untested on a stage of such consequence. Each carried the weight of his constituents' expectations, as well as personal beliefs. Their conversations moved gently between agreement and doubt, principle and pragmatism. Decisions were not urgent. They were carefully considered, as if each word could tip the balance between calm and crisis. Meetings unfolded in a manner that mirrored the atmosphere of the colonies themselves, thoughtful, restrained, and deliberate. Delegates debated the nature of loyalty and authority, reflecting on the rights of citizens versus the demands of the crown. Some emphasized the importance of preserving connection to Britain, valuing stability and shared history. Others voiced frustration at distant control, highlighting how laws and taxes had begun to shape lives in ways that felt constraining. The tension was real, but it did not erupt. It was intellectual, subtle, and measured. In quiet chambers, ideas were exchanged like careful currency. Pamphlets and letters informed discussion, giving context to local grievances and distant events. Stories from towns affected by the intolerable acts were recounted, shared thoughtfully to illustrate principle rather than stoke emotion. Delegates listened as much as they spoke, recognizing that patience and reflection were as important as speech in shaping decisions that would ripple far beyond Philadelphia's streets. Hesitation was constant. The choice to push for change, to resist, or even to discuss disobedience openly was weighed against the possibility of personal and communal risk. Separation from Britain carried unimaginable consequences. Families, trade, and daily life were bound to an empire that, despite its restrictions, offered protection and familiarity. The men considered the gravity of turning away from that connection, imagining futures that were unknown and potentially perilous. Every pause, every thoughtful question added depth to their understanding. Yet in hesitation, a new sense of unity quietly formed. Colonies that had often operated independently now found common ground. Differences of wealth, geography, and local custom were acknowledged, but the shared experience of constraint created bonds that were slow, gentle, and subtle. Delegates began to imagine what coordinated action could look like, even if that action remained hypothetical for the moment. The act of gathering itself sent a signal. The colonies could deliberate together, not as isolated towns, but as a collective conscience. The atmosphere was calm, though charged with latent energy. Night fell over Philadelphia, and oil lamps flickered against walls filled with maps and ledgers. Discussions continued into quiet hours, often punctuated by reflection and careful note-taking. Men considered petitions, boycotts, and other measures that required no bloodshed. They imagined the consequences, weighing risk against principle, and listening carefully to the subtle voices of caution and conviction alike. In these moments, history seemed to pause. Decisions had not yet been made. No war loomed, no guns had been raised. Only thought, deliberation, and awareness shaped the path forward. The active meeting of choosing words and strategies with care became an event in itself, a demonstration that resistance could begin with reflection, patience, and dialogue. For the colonies, the First Continental Congress created a mirror of their own complexities. Choices existed, but certainty did not. Loyalty, fear, principle, and practicality all collided in calm debate, leaving room for imagination and foresight. Delegates returned home carrying not an immediate solution, but a shared understanding of possibility, responsibility, and consequence. The evening streets of Philadelphia fell silent as meetings adjourned, leaving only the quiet hum of contemplation. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the decisions shaping its future. Inside, the seeds of unity, deliberation, and identity had been sown. The moment rested in stillness, balanced between caution and courage, reflection and action, marking a chapter in which hesitation itself became a deliberate force in the shaping of history. Before dawn on a crisp April morning in 1775, the villages of Lexington and Concord lay wrapped in mist. The air was damp and still, carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked grass and smoke from distant hearths. Streets were empty except for occasional footsteps, the soft echo of boots on packed dirt blending with the whisper of wind through trees. The world felt calm, ordinary, as though nothing in particular had yet begun. But in the shadows, both sides were awake. Minutemen gathered quietly in the village square, their presence deliberate but unassuming. They carried muskets and powder, tools of defense more than aggression, held close to their sides rather than raised in challenge. Across the fields, British soldiers moved with measured precision, their orders clear, their purpose defined by authority and duty. Neither side sought chaos, both followed instinct and instruction, unaware that a single moment could alter the course of history. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation that was hard to name. Eyes watched from windows, footsteps paused mid-step, and conversations whispered in corners. The tension was subtle, a quiet hum beneath the ordinary sounds of village life. There was no trumpet, no drum, no grand declaration, only breath, leather, and the soft rustle of clothing as men shifted uneasily. Then, in a brief and uncertain instant, a shot rang out. Historians have long debated which side fired first, but in that morning mist the distinction mattered little. The sound was sharp, startling, and yet it faded quickly, leaving silence almost immediately afterward. For those present, it was a signal, not an explanation. Confusion followed. Some raised their weapons, others froze, and the village itself seemed to hold its breath. Chaos remained contained, not yet expansive. Skirmishes moved along the village green and nearby roads, measured in yards rather than miles. Orders were given softly, shouted only when necessary, and movements were cautious. Men on both sides acted with a combination of fear and training, unsure how far the encounter would extend. No one anticipated the ripple it would create, the way a single morning could mark the beginning of a larger story. As soldiers moved toward Concord, the countryside witnessed a transformation of ordinary space into a stage for conflict. Fields became paths of advance and retreat, fences and barns became temporary cover. The mist obscured detail, leaving gestures and shadows to convey intent. People peered from windows and behind trees, unsure whether to stay or flee, the ordinary rhythm of life suspended by uncertainty. Messages were sent quickly on horseback and by foot. Riders traced familiar roads, carrying word of the engagement to neighboring towns. The sound of gunfire, though brief, traveled farther than the bullets themselves. Rumors spread, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, each retelling adding subtle tension without overwhelming anyone. Awareness of war began to infiltrate daily life gently, like a new season arriving slowly across the countryside. For the villagers, this morning carried more than immediate danger. It was a moment of realization. The world they knew, shaped by laws, loyalty, and routine, had shifted imperceptibly. Footsteps had begun to echo differently. Fields no longer felt merely familiar. They held the memory of muskets and sudden movement. The ordinary sounds of birds and wind contrasted with the new, fragile knowledge that life might now include conflict. By the end of the day, resistance had solidified quietly. British soldiers continued their march, colonial forces skirmished and retreated strategically, and both sides began to understand that nothing would remain as it had been. Violence existed, but it was restrained, shaped by circumstance and hesitation rather than deliberate aggression. In the evening, the villages returned to a deceptive calm. Smoke curled from hearths, families spoke in hushed tones, and the mist settled once more over fields and roads. Yet the morning's events had left an indelible mark. A war had begun not with banners or declarations, but with steps, voices, and a single gunshot. History had shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, leaving ordinary life carrying a new awareness, the calm forever altered by the knowledge that conflict could arrive silently, yet irrevocably. After the first shots at Lexington and Concord, the world seemed to hold its breath. Boston, once a city defined by commerce and quiet streets, became a place of watchfulness and expectation. Soldiers and civilians alike adjusted to a new rhythm, one defined not by battle, but by waiting. The city's harbor, streets, and hills were filled with observation rather than action, creating a sense of tension softened by stillness. Patience became a strategy. Colonial forces now gathered around the city, fortified positions on hills and along ridges, not to charge but to contain. Each movement was deliberate, minimal, conserving energy and resources. The British, confined largely within the city, maintained their routines while remaining alert. Both sides knew that haste could lead to disaster, and so time itself became a weapon, stretching hours into days and days into weeks. The landscape of the siege was familiar, yet charged. Fields and forests around Boston were traversed quietly by patrols, scouts, and couriers. Soldiers rested in shifts, cleaned weapons, and monitored movements across the skyline. Smoke rose gently from hearths in towns and farms, carrying the comforting scent of wood fires even as observation continued. Life persisted amid preparation, creating a rhythm that felt calm even in the presence of conflict. Communication flowed slowly, carried by messengers on horseback along winding roads. Each letter, report, or conversation was deliberate, measured in tone and content. Leaders on both sides observed carefully, weighing options before making decisions. Decisions were often delayed, creating long periods of quiet reflection that filled the hours with anticipation rather than immediate action. For citizens of Boston, the siege transformed daily life. Markets remained open but watched, schools continued quietly, and families moved carefully through streets lined with soldiers. The presence of red coats was constant, yet subdued. Their discipline and routine created a sense of order, while the knowledge of surrounding colonial forces lent a gentle edge of uncertainty. Life balanced between normality and heightened awareness, a tension felt without alarm. Evenings brought softer observation. The sun set slowly over the harbor, reflecting on calm waters where ships lay anchored in cautious stillness. Lanterns glimmered in windows, signaling continuity amid change. Conversations in homes and taverns turned toward speculation and planning rather than panic. People measured risks quietly, considering what the days ahead might require. In this way, patience became both shield and tool, shaping perception and preserving strength. In the countryside, militias maintained positions along hills and ridges, moving only when necessary. Scouts traced familiar paths, recording information and returning without incident. Activity was minimal, deliberate, and slow. The silence between movements allowed time for observation, strategy, and thought. Waiting became a form of engagement, proving that war did not always roar. It could whisper, linger, and bend the mind through anticipation rather than bullets. Weather, too, played its part. Rain softened the earth, fog obscured distant hills, and snow arrived quietly to blanket the countryside. Each change demanded adaptation, encouraging patience and planning. Soldiers and citizens alike learned to move with consideration, respecting the environment and the rhythm of the season. Nature itself slowed the tempo, reinforcing the calm yet watchful atmosphere that defined the siege. Within Boston, small gestures of continuity preserved life's steadiness. Children played cautiously in yards, markets exchanged goods under careful observation, and daily routines, washing, cooking, repairing, continued uninterrupted. The presence of war became a background hum, a condition to navigate rather than an immediate threat. The contrast between external tension and internal normality created a rhythm uniquely suited to reflection and endurance. By the time weeks had passed, both sides had learned the subtle art of engagement without movement. Soldiers and civilians observed patterns, anticipated behavior, and conserved energy. The siege was not defined by heroics or dramatic confrontation, but by steady, deliberate existence. The passage of time itself became meaningful, teaching that patience could serve as a weapon, observation as strategy, and calm as preparation. Evenings closed over Boston with a gentle hush. Lanterns glimmered in homes, fires burned low, and the city exhaled quietly beneath the stars. The siege continued, invisible to many beyond the hills, yet felt deeply by those who observed its rhythm. Life had adapted, tension had softened, and the slow, deliberate dance of waiting became the defining mark of a conflict that, for the moment, existed more in anticipation than action. As the siege of Boston stretched into weeks, the colonies recognized a quiet truth. Their resistance required coordination, leadership, and someone who could unify disparate militias under a single purpose. They needed a figure who could command respect without demanding it, who could guide with presence rather than force. The choice would not be easy, and the qualities sought were subtle: dignity, patience, and the ability to inspire confidence through action, not words. George Washington's name emerged almost reluctantly. He was a man of experience from previous military service, yet he did not crave authority. He carried himself with composure rather than bravado, attentive to detail yet willing to defer to the counsel of others. To many, he seemed calm in the face of uncertainty, a steady hand when moments demanded discretion. His reputation was one of integrity, measured judgment, and persistence. These qualities made him an ideal candidate in a time when rashness could prove fatal. Deliberations over leadership were thoughtful and careful. Delegates from different colonies shared opinions, recalled experiences, and assessed personalities. Washington's strengths were discussed at length: his familiarity with military discipline, his understanding of logistics, and his ability to navigate political complexities. But beyond skill, there was a subtler question. Could a man who did not seek power inspire unity? Could quiet confidence outweigh the appeal of charisma and rhetoric? These questions lingered, shaping the choice as much as any formal consideration. Washington himself received the attention with characteristic reserve. He did not press for command. He expressed awareness of the weight of responsibility and the challenges it would bring. In private, he considered the enormity of what lay ahead, not for glory, but for duty. His acceptance would not come lightly, and it reflected a deliberate understanding of service rather than ambition. This humility, paradoxically, became one of his strongest qualifications. Colonial leaders observed not just military capability, but temperament. They imagined the challenges of coordinating forces spread across towns, villages, and remote frontiers. Communication would be slow, resources scarce, and loyalty fragile. Leadership would require patience as much as courage, listening as much as instructing. In this, Washington's steadiness offered reassurance, a presence that could anchor strategy while allowing others to contribute their knowledge and experience. The choice of commander was not a dramatic moment. There were no proclamations, no parades. Delegates agreed quietly, trusting judgment and character rather than spectacle. Washington was appointed, not celebrated, and he accepted, mindful of both honor and obligation. The process itself mirrored the cautious rhythm of the colonies, deliberate, thoughtful, and measured. For soldiers, the presence of a commander provided subtle guidance. They felt the assurance of experience, the calm that comes from observing someone who understands consequence without being hurried by emotion. Washington's leadership was not about issuing commands with force. It was about creating a framework in which others could act confidently, safely, and with purpose. Morale grew not through words alone, but through observation of competence and restraint. Evenings under Washington's early command were quiet. Camps settled into routine. Drills proceeded steadily. Reports arrived and were assessed, not rushed. Decisions unfolded thoughtfully, with attention to both logistics and human endurance. Washington's calm presence shaped not only strategy, but the emotional landscape of those around him. In the uncertain days of siege and skirmish, such steadiness became a kind of anchor, offering reassurance amid tension. Beyond the military sphere, Washington's appointment carried symbolic weight. Colonists recognized in him a reflection of ideals they valued: humility, diligence, and responsibility. Leadership did not always demand spectacle. It could emerge quietly through integrity, patience, and consistency. By placing trust in him, the colonies signaled that authority could be gentle, considered, and effective without overwhelming presence. In the months that followed, Washington's role would grow, but his character would remain consistent. He acted with awareness of risk, deference to counsel, and commitment to principle. The selection of a commander had transformed a diffuse resistance into a coordinated effort, anchored by a man whose quiet strength provided a sense of stability and direction. For the colonies, he became more than a general. He became a steady presence amid uncertainty, a point around which hope, patience, and strategy could revolve. As nights fell over encampments, fires glimmered softly across hills. Soldiers rested with the knowledge that their efforts were guided by someone deliberate, attentive, and consistent. Leadership, they realized, could be measured in calm action rather than noise, in thoughtful presence rather than insistence. In Washington, the colonies found a figure who could unify, steady, and inspire, quietly shaping the path forward as the distant rumble of war settled into its patient rhythm. In the quiet spaces of colonial life, ideas began to stir, softly at first, like a breeze moving through the branches of familiar trees. In parlors lit by candlelight, men and women discussed what life could be without the distant hand of Britain. These were not loud proclamations or dramatic speeches, but gentle exchanges over tea, by the warmth of a hearth, or in the hushed corners of taverns where travelers shared news from other towns. It was in these spaces that the seeds of independence first took root, carried on words, questions, and reflection rather than on muskets or banners. Printed pamphlets circulated carefully, their pages filled with arguments that challenged the natural order of authority. Writers spoke of natural rights, the inalienable claims that every individual possessed simply by being human. They questioned whether a distant king could fairly impose taxes, control trade, or station soldiers in streets where families lived their daily lives. These ideas were novel, yet they resonated quietly with those who had long felt the subtle pressures of imperial control. Listeners could almost hear the turning of minds, the slow bending of loyalty toward self-determination. Conversations moved between philosophy and practicality. It was one thing to imagine rights in theory, and another to navigate their implications in life. How could a community govern itself if it were free from distant oversight? What responsibilities would independence entail? Taxes, law, and defense were no longer abstract. They were part of the conversation now. People began to weigh the cost of liberty, not as a rallying cry, but as a question to be answered thoughtfully. In taverns, the debate was quiet yet vibrant. Voices rose occasionally, not in anger but in wonder and curiosity. Neighbors asked one another what freedom might look like, how it could be achieved without undoing the delicate fabric of everyday life. The questions themselves were enough to begin change. Each conversation spread subtly, adding depth to the sense that something different, something unprecedented, was possible. Ideas moved like ripples in water, gentle and persistent, reaching farther than anyone could track. Philosophers and thinkers contributed their reflections through writing, allowing distance to add weight to the words. A pamphlet sent from Boston might find its way into a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, where a farmer or his family considered the implications quietly in the evening light. Ideas became companions, almost invisible yet profoundly present, shaping thought without demanding immediate action. There was no urgency, only awareness, and the calm curiosity of listeners allowed them to absorb concepts at their own pace. Ordinary citizens, too, began to feel the shift. Conversations in marketplaces, at river crossings, and along dusty roads carried the same questions. Children might overhear adults pondering the fairness of governance or the morality of obedience. The accumulation of quiet reflection created a collective consciousness, subtle but significant. The notion of independence was not yet a plan. It was a feeling, a gentle recognition that life could be arranged differently, more justly, more freely. Even as discussions continued, loyalty to the crown lingered, soft but present. The colonists were not yet rebels. They were thinkers and observers, measuring each idea against experience and tradition. This balance of reflection and loyalty made the eventual shift toward independence more profound. It was a choice slowly emerging from thought rather than emotion, from careful consideration rather than impulse. The rhythm of daily life persisted alongside these ideas. Families tended gardens, merchants prepared shipments, and children played in streets that seemed unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, minds were stretching, imagining alternative futures. The quiet awareness of possibility began to shape actions, however subtly. Letters composed with care, petitions drafted with precision, gatherings held for discussion rather than celebration. Thought itself became a gentle force for change. Questions circulated naturally, embedded in reflection. Could a distant idea grow into collective resolve? Might a single question whispered in a home or read in a pamphlet eventually inspire coordinated action? The process was not immediate, and it did not demand intensity. Instead, it relied on the slow, patient accumulation of understanding, curiosity, and dialogue. By the end of these early exchanges, independence existed first as a concept rather than a declaration. It was a quiet, reflective revolution of thought, a gentle bending of loyalty toward the notion that governance could serve the people rather than the distant crown. In this calm, meditative space, listeners sensed the very beginnings of a monumental journey, one shaped by ideas, conversation, and the patient unfolding of collective imagination. Philadelphia, in the summer of 1776, became a quiet stage for extraordinary deliberation. Delegates from across the 13 colonies arrived, carrying letters, petitions, and their own convictions. The city's streets hummed softly with the arrival of carriages, horses, hooves clicking against cobblestones, and the occasional greeting exchanged between neighbors. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, a subtle tension threaded through the air. the kind that grows from the knowledge that each choice carries weight far beyond the walls of the meeting hall. Inside the assembly rooms, the atmosphere was one of careful attention. Men moved with deliberation, reading correspondence, consulting notes, and exchanging thoughts in low, measured tones. The conversation was not hurried, every statement was weighed, every pause intentional. The stakes were extraordinary, yet the delivery was calm, reflecting the thoughtfulness of those present. Delegates understood that hastiness could cloud judgment, and that words chosen in haste might ripple through history in ways impossible to control. Debates unfolded slowly, exploring both principle and practicality. Some argued that independence was necessary, that the Crown's repeated impositions on trade, law, and daily life had exhausted the possibilities for reconciliation. Others counseled patience, emphasizing negotiation and the risks of separation. Questions were asked gently, yet persistently. How far can loyalty extend before it becomes complicity? What price might be paid for rebellion? Could diplomacy still alter the course of events? Each inquiry invited reflection, inviting listeners to step into the minds of men considering choices that balanced ethics, risk, and duty. As ideas circulated, drafts of formal declarations began to take shape. Pages of parchment were spread across tables, inked words carefully read aloud and discussed. Sentences were rearranged, phrasing debated, and subtle changes made to ensure clarity and impact. The goal was not drama but precision. Every word needed to convey principle without exaggeration, conviction without provocation. Even a single phrase could carry the weight of a nation's future, and delegates treated each choice with the reverence of understanding its long-term consequences. Disagreements were common, though never explosive. Men leaned forward, elbows resting on tables, voices steady but earnest. Some questioned the necessity of certain statements, others pushed for bolder declarations. Compromise became the art that guided the room, balancing assertiveness with caution. Listeners might imagine the careful back and forth, the gentle hum of debate under chandeliers, the scribbling of notes, and the quiet rustle of paper as drafts evolved. This was history being made not through force, but through measured intellect and human connection. Outside the chambers, the city seemed ordinary, yet the sense of anticipation subtly permeated daily life. Citizens noticed the influx of delegates and the unusual number of carriages on the streets, yet the work continued with calm routine. Merchants opened shops, children played in quiet courtyards, and neighbors exchanged observations in hushed tones. The juxtaposition of extraordinary decision-making and ordinary life reinforced the gravity of the discussions, highlighting the extraordinary care with which the future was being shaped. Within the hall, attention to detail extended to the smallest of matters. Commas and clauses, the order of sentences, and the tone of proclamations were all debated with care. Delegates understood that the message needed to reach not only their contemporaries but future generations. It needed to articulate justification for independence while maintaining moral clarity. The process was meticulous, requiring patience, reflection, and careful listening. Each moment of hesitation, each consideration, strengthened the sense that these men were shaping history with thoughtfulness rather than impulse. As discussions progressed, consensus began to emerge. The delegates recognized a shared commitment to principles that transcended individual colonies or personal interests. Freedom, representation, and the right to self-governance became common threads weaving through speeches, notes, and drafts. The process was slow, deliberate, and profoundly human, allowing the audience to feel the weight of decision without the sharpness of alarm. The drafting of the declaration became both an intellectual and emotional exercise. Delegates understood that words carried power, that each phrase would influence not just contemporaries but future generations. They balanced caution with courage, reflection with resolve, and rhetoric with substance. Listeners can sense the rhythm of thought and debate. Pause, speak, consider, revise. The act of writing became an extension of reflection itself, the careful crafting of sentences a mirror of the careful crafting of a nation's future. By the time drafts were completed and refined, a quiet clarity emerged. Independence was no longer a distant idea discussed in pamphlets or taverns. It had become a tangible possibility, articulated through words chosen with care and deliberation. The deliberative process had allowed uncertainty to coexist with conviction, reflection to coexist with purpose, and discussion to coexist with eventual decision. The assembly left the chamber each day with a growing awareness of the monumental choice before them. Conversations continued quietly in hallways, over meals, and in evening walks along cobblestone streets. Listeners are invited to inhabit this space of calm deliberation. sensing the deliberate rhythm of thought that transforms uncertainty into resolve. The weight of freedom, measured carefully in ink and reflection, hung in the air gently, preparing both delegates and audience for the pivotal moment when ideas would take the final, deliberate step into history. The summer sun hung low over Philadelphia, casting long shadows across streets that had grown accustomed to the slow rhythm of deliberation. Inside the assembly hall, the delegates gathered once more, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns and the pale light filtering through high windows. This day carried a quiet gravity, unlike any other. The abstract notions of liberty and self-governance, which had lingered as conversation and contemplation for months, were about to take formal, tangible shape. The Declaration of Independence was presented, its words deliberate, precise, and carefully chosen. Unlike the roar of cannon or the clash of muskets, this revolution spoke in sentences and clauses, in the cadence of thought made permanent on parchment. Each line was crafted to articulate principle, explain reason, and justify action, creating a bridge between ideas and the people they represented. Listeners can imagine the careful reading aloud, the pause after each phrase, the sense of respect for the weight of what was being uttered. Delegates listened attentively, absorbing each phrase and considering its implications. There was no need for haste. The power of the document lay not in immediate action, but in clarity, logic, and conviction. Words themselves became instruments of change. By explicitly declaring independence, the colonies transformed speculation and debate into a shared commitment, a common understanding that they were embarking on a path defined by self-determination. Outside the hall, news spread gently through Philadelphia's streets. Citizens paused in markets, children looked up from play, and neighbors exchanged careful whispers about the words that had just been spoken. Reading and discussion followed, each household absorbing the meaning at its own pace. The impact was profound, yet subtle. A nation in formation, experienced slowly rather than explosively. Life around this historic moment continued with ordinary rhythms. Merchants sold wares, artisans worked in quiet shops, and families tended gardens. And yet beneath these familiar routines, awareness of change settled, permanent, and inescapable. The Declaration itself balanced principle with persuasion. It articulated grievances, outlined philosophical foundations, and asserted the right of the colonies to govern themselves. Its language spoke of universal truths, moral clarity, and the responsibilities of government to its people. Each word carried intent, each paragraph purpose. The revolution was not measured by immediate victories on the battlefield, but by the quiet force of reason and the ability to unify minds across distance and circumstance. In reading the Declaration, one senses the patience and care of its authors. This was not a document composed in haste or emotion. It was the product of months of reflection, debate, and refinement. Each sentence was considered for its clarity, resonance, and long-term significance. Delegates understood that the words might be read for generations, shaping understanding, identity, and principle far beyond the immediate moment. The power of history was present in the meticulous arrangement of ideas, demonstrating that revolutions can unfold in deliberate, reflective steps rather than sudden leaps. Citizens across the colonies reacted with quiet contemplation. Letters were written, conversations held, and pamphlets circulated. Families gathered to read aloud, communities discussed the meaning, and local leaders reflected on the responsibilities that independence now implied. There was excitement, yes, but it was tempered with thoughtfulness and awareness of the responsibilities to follow. The document was a catalyst, not a climax, preparing the population for the long, measured journey ahead. Even the imagery of the Declaration, the careful, deliberate signatures of representatives from each colony, reinforced the unity and seriousness of the act. These were not merely names on paper. They were commitments, affirmations that individuals were prepared to shoulder risk, guide action, and embody the principles they had spent months articulating. The act of signing became a quiet, resolute performance, a reflection of purpose without spectacle, inspiring respect and reflection rather than fanfare. The adoption of the Declaration transformed abstract thought into collective action. Ideas that had circulated in parlors, taverns, and pamphlets now carried the authority of formal declaration. Independence was no longer speculation. It was articulated, deliberate, and public. The moment embodied reflection, patience, and deliberate choice, showing that history's most significant transformations often unfold through careful thought and measured consensus. In the evening, Philadelphia settled into calm. Lanterns glimmered in windows, and a soft hush descended over streets that had witnessed extraordinary deliberation. The day's events were monumental, yet life continued quietly around them. Families dined, trades continued, and the rhythm of ordinary life persisted, infused now with the knowledge that their world had shifted irrevocably. The revolution had been declared, not with a shout, but with thought, intention, and words whose impact would resonate for generations. For listeners, this moment serves as both climax and reflection, a demonstration that monumental change can emerge from patience, reason, and careful articulation. The quiet force of ideas, once nurtured and debated, had finally become a living reality. Freedom was now tangible, expressed not through battle alone, but through the deliberate, enduring power of words. As the summer of 1776 unfolded, the revolution transitioned from ideas and declarations to the careful, measured reality of military engagement. The colonies, now formally asserting independence, faced the daunting task of coordinating forces scattered across towns, farms, and forests. Yet the battles were not sudden explosions of chaos. They were deliberate maneuvers, exercises in strategy, patience, and observation, unfolding with the quiet rhythm of thought made manifest on the field. Troop movements were methodical. Minutemen and Continental soldiers traveled along familiar roads, crossing streams and hills while keeping a cautious eye on the horizon. Their muskets rested at their sides rather than raised aggressively, signaling readiness without immediate threat. Orders were given softly, measured, and precise, ensuring that each man understood his place and purpose. Scouts moved ahead to observe enemy positions, sending reports back to commanders with careful attention to accuracy and timing. The audience listening in can sense the subtle tension of observation, the anticipation that exists when action is restrained yet purposeful. Encampments became the backbone of strategy. Soldiers dug trenches, reinforced fences, and established supply points. Fires burned steadily, casting warm light against tents and makeshift shelters, while the murmurs of conversation carried instructions, updates, and encouragement. The camp was alive with quiet activity, laundry being washed in streams, food prepared over embers, horses tended in stalls. Each routine act reinforced discipline, cohesion, and preparedness. The narrative emphasizes these ordinary details, showing that war's reality is often shaped more by logistics and planning than by loud conflict. Reconnaissance played a pivotal role in the early stages of the struggle. Couriers rode along winding paths, observing troop formations and reporting positions with care. Spies and informants gathered information discreetly, returning with details that could determine the placement of forces or the timing of maneuvers. Listeners are guided through these processes with a calm, measured cadence, emphasizing thoughtfulness over drama. Even small decisions, where to station a sentry, how to position a battery of artillery, carried weight, yet unfolded gently in narration, allowing the audience to follow without feeling alarmed. Skirmishes occurred, brief and contained. The sound of gunfire was occasional rather than constant, echoing across fields or through the forests, fading quickly into silence. These encounters were tactical, designed to probe enemy strength, protect supply lines, or test morale. Soldiers learned to act with restraint, measuring every move to avoid unnecessary loss while gaining valuable experience. The story of these early engagements is one of careful adjustment, a sequence of small, deliberate choices rather than dramatic, sweeping conflict. The landscape itself became a participant in strategy. Mist clung to valleys in the mornings, forests provided cover, and streams dictated movement. Commanders considered terrain as carefully as men or supplies. A hilltop might offer observation but leave troops exposed. A river crossing could delay movement but provide natural defense. Listeners are invited to imagine the slow, deliberate assessment of fields, roads, and weather, recognizing that war is as much a mental exercise as a physical one. Communication, though slower than modern standards, shaped every decision. Orders were relayed with clarity and repetition, ensuring that troops remained coordinated. Couriers became lifelines, their careful journeys carrying the thread of command across miles. The suspense was gentle, created by the anticipation of information rather than sudden danger. Observers could sense the interplay of preparation and patience, the way strategy moved subtly, quietly, and inexorably toward its goals. Even in moments of tension, reflection remained central. Soldiers observed, assessed, and adjusted. Leaders consulted one another, weighing options, considering outcomes, and imagining consequences before acting. Each maneuver was a question in motion: how far to advance, where to hold, when to retreat. The audience, guided by calm narration, can follow this process as if walking alongside the commanders, feeling engagement through observation rather than alarm. By the end of these early encounters, a pattern emerged. Conflict was present but contained, progress was measured, and understanding grew among both officers and men. The revolution was no longer abstract thought. It was disciplined, thoughtful action unfolding gradually across the countryside. Listeners are invited to experience strategy as a living, breathing part of the story, appreciating the quiet tension, anticipation, and careful decision-making that define the early stages of war. The early battles of the revolution remind us that history is often shaped by patience as much as by valor. The quiet discipline of preparation, the deliberate positioning of men and resources, and the thoughtful assessment of each situation set the stage for larger engagements yet to come. In this way, strategy itself becomes compelling, drawing listeners into the narrative through reflection, insight, and gentle curiosity rather than through the clamor of chaos. Even as troops marched, camps were set, and skirmishes unfolded across fields and hills, life for ordinary colonists continued, shaped by the quiet rhythms of endurance and adaptation. Families rose with the dawn, tending gardens and livestock, aware that news from the front might arrive at any moment. Merchants opened shops cautiously, mindful of both opportunity and risk, while children played under the watchful eyes of parents, their laughter punctuating streets touched by tension but not overwhelmed by it. The revolution had arrived, but it existed alongside daily life rather than replacing it. Homes became places of both refuge and subtle vigilance. Cooking fires glimmered in kitchens, washing hung on lines that stretched across yards, and bread was kneaded with care. Parents whispered reassurances to their children, answering questions about distant battles with measured honesty. Even as uncertainty lingered, resilience grew quietly. Listeners can sense the deliberate balance between ordinary routines and the knowledge that danger and change were never far away, a tension experienced softly rather than explosively. Merchants and tradespeople adjusted their practices to the rhythms of wartime. Supplies were rationed, shipments delayed, and pricing negotiated with greater care. Decisions were made with patience, accounting not just for profit, but for sustainability and survival. A blacksmith might spend hours repairing tools essential for both domestic life and military support, while a tailor ensured uniforms and clothing were mended with quiet precision. Each action, though small, carried significance in sustaining the community through uncertain times. News traveled slowly, carried by messengers on horseback or letters tucked into satchels. Families gathered in the evenings to read updates aloud, piecing together the progress of skirmishes and the movements of distant armies. Conversations in taverns, markets, and private homes reflected cautious curiosity. Speculation mingled with concern, and ideas were tested gently among neighbors. The audience can imagine this ebb and flow of information, understanding that emotional investment was real but moderated, allowing life to proceed with both attention and calm. Adaptation became a subtle art. Communities organized local watches, coordinated supplies, and assisted those displaced or in need. The invisible tension of potential conflict encouraged cooperation rather than panic. Individuals learned to adjust their schedules, conserve resources, and anticipate change without succumbing to fear. Listeners experienced these quiet adaptations as a testament to human resilience, emphasizing reflection and observation over dramatized peril. Personal courage emerged in small, deliberate ways. A parent walking children along roads shared by soldiers, a farmer transporting food to a neighboring settlement, a shopkeeper maintaining calm in the face of uncertainty, all demonstrated bravery not through bold gestures, but through steadfastness. These acts, often unnoticed in the larger scope of history, shaped the social fabric, sustaining morale and continuity. For late-night listeners, this depiction provides gentle inspiration, a sense of heroism that is intimate and relatable rather than overwhelming. Even in moments of scarcity, patience proved essential. Families rationed meals, mended clothing, and repaired homes with care. Decisions were slow, considered, and collaborative, reinforcing bonds within communities. The revolution was present, yet it did not dominate the lives of those far from battlefields. Life unfolded with an intertwined sense of continuity and cautious attention, offering listeners a rhythm that is immersive yet soothing. Religious and social gatherings persisted, albeit with awareness of external pressures. Churches held services, small meetings convened for support or planning, and neighbors exchanged guidance and comfort. These interactions reinforced the notion that life could endure amid uncertainty, that shared experience and quiet reflection were as vital as strategy on the field. The narration emphasizes these human moments, allowing listeners to absorb both the weight and resilience of civilian life. Evenings brought a gentle calm, with households settling under the glow of lanterns or hearth fires. Conversations recounted the day's routines, reflected on minor victories, and expressed hope for continued stability. The soft cadence of daily life contrasted with the occasional distant sound of musket or drum, reminding listeners that the revolution was ongoing yet experienced most profoundly through patience, care, and thoughtful presence. Through these ordinary yet meaningful acts, the audience senses the emotional landscape of war without dramatized peaks. Courage is measured not in spectacle, but in persistence. Heroism lies in adaptation and endurance. By following families, merchants, and townspeople as they navigate uncertainty, listeners experience a human-centered perspective of conflict, one that maintains engagement while soothing the mind, preparing for reflection, contemplation, and eventually rest. As the revolution stretched across the colonies, its leaders recognized that survival and eventual victory could not rely solely on local resources. The fledgling Continental Army was young, inexperienced, and often poorly equipped. Beyond strategy and courage, they needed allies, nations willing to support their cause with resources, expertise, and perhaps most importantly, recognition. The pursuit of foreign support became a delicate art, a combination of diplomacy, persuasion, and patience, where words carried as much weight as armies. Delegates and envoys embarked on journeys to distant ports and courts, carrying letters and petitions that outlined grievances, articulated principles, and described the urgent needs of a people asserting their independence. In Paris, for instance, representatives carefully explained the philosophical and practical rationale for supporting the colonies. They emphasized shared interests, the potential for trade, and the alignment of ideals about governance and freedom. Each communication was crafted with care, anticipating questions, skepticism, and the subtle signals of trustworthiness. Negotiations unfolded in quiet chambers and candlelit rooms, often removed from the immediate attention of the public. Couriers delivered messages sealed with wax, their contents read slowly and with consideration. The risk of interception or misinterpretation added weight to each phrase, and envoys measured their language meticulously. Listeners can sense the tension of deliberation, not through sudden conflict, but through the slow accumulation of trust and understanding, a process that felt almost invisible yet profoundly consequential. France emerged as the most critical potential ally. Leaders there weighed their own national interests against the moral and strategic appeal of supporting a distant rebellion. French officials considered trade opportunities, the chance to weaken a rival power, and the broader implications of formal alliance. The correspondence was cautious yet curious. Colonists, envoys navigated these conversations with finesse, balancing frankness with respect, persistence with humility, and advocacy with patience. Each letter, each meeting was a step in a long, deliberate dance of diplomacy. Support also extended beyond France. Individuals in other European nations provided financial assistance, advice on military organization, and access to resources otherwise unavailable to the colonies. These contributions were often discreet, shared quietly to protect both donors and recipients. The revolution became a networked effort, dependent on connections, trust, and careful coordination. Listeners can imagine the subtle intrigue of distant correspondence, the excitement of receiving word of approval or aid, and the soft tension of waiting for confirmation or response. Back in the colonies, news of these diplomatic efforts circulated slowly. Meetings in taverns, letters read aloud in homes, and whispers in town squares conveyed the sense that the world beyond their shores was taking notice. The narrative emphasizes anticipation rather than action. The emotional impact comes from hope, planning, and the delicate possibility that distant nations could shape the outcome of local struggle. Citizens absorbed these developments with measured curiosity, aware that support could transform the path of the revolution, yet that uncertainty remained. The intricacies of diplomacy required patience. Envoys had to anticipate questions, objections, and negotiations that might stretch over months or years. Each interaction was a test of credibility, tact, and foresight. The audience is invited to follow these quiet processes, sensing the intellectual and strategic effort that underpinned seemingly simple announcements of aid or alliance. It was a war fought in salons and offices as much as on fields, demonstrating that human thought and negotiation could be as decisive as muskets or cannons. Trust, carefully cultivated, became the linchpin of this international effort. Colonists worked to demonstrate reliability, sincerity, and principle, while foreign powers evaluated potential benefits and risks. Small gestures, a precise phrase in a letter, a timely report, a personal appeal, shaped perceptions, built relationships, and moved plans forward. Listeners are guided gently through these subtle interactions, understanding that diplomacy, patience, and thoughtful communication were themselves acts of strategy. Even as envoys pursued support abroad, the war continued at home. The coordination of alliances did not halt battles, nor did it erase the daily struggles of soldiers and civilians. Instead, it introduced new possibilities, providing hope, expanding resources, and creating a sense of interconnectedness that bridged continents. The revolution was no longer a local affair. It was part of a broader global context, influenced by decisions made thousands of miles away, yet experienced intimately by colonists in towns and farms. In reflecting on alliances and support, the audience perceives the quiet power of trust and thoughtfulness. Major outcomes were shaped not only by courage on the battlefield, but by careful communication, planning, and relationships cultivated across oceans. The revolution's expansion into the international stage is portrayed not with dramatic intensity, but through anticipation, intellect, and subtle influence. For listeners, this section deepens understanding, expands scope, and sets the stage for larger-scale events, all while maintaining a calm, immersive rhythm. As winter descended upon Pennsylvania in 1777, the Continental Army settled into the quiet stillness of Valley Forge. Snow blanketed the ground and frost clung to trees and tents alike. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and the damp tang of frozen earth. Life in the camp was marked not by the chaos of battle, but by the subtle rhythm of endurance. Soldiers faced days that blended into nights, each moment demanding patience, persistence, and resilience in ways both physical and emotional. The cold was relentless. Muskets and uniforms offered little protection against the biting wind, and many soldiers wore layers patched and worn from previous campaigns. Hands stiffened from frost, feet blistered and wet from the frozen ground, yet the men persisted. Meals were sparse, often consisting of meager rations boiled over a small flame. Hunger gnawed quietly at morale, yet the army endured, driven by the shared sense of purpose that had carried them from the early skirmishes. Listeners are drawn into this atmosphere not through alarm, but through reflective observation, sensing the slow accumulation of trial and fortitude. Illness swept through the camp, invisible yet insistent. Smallpox, dysentery, and fever claimed attention and strength, testing both bodies and spirits. Yet even amid suffering, moments of care and camaraderie emerged. Soldiers tended one another, shared blankets, and offered quiet encouragement. Letters from home, arriving sporadically, reminded them of the lives and communities that waited beyond the frost-covered trees. The narration emphasizes these human details, guiding listeners gently through hardship without overwhelming tension. Training became a form of quiet triumph. General Washington, aware of the need to transform a fledgling army into a disciplined force, worked with Baron von Steuben and other experienced officers to instill routine, skill, and cohesion. Drills repeated in the morning cold, commands practiced until they became instinct, and formations honed into precision. These small victories, born of discipline and perseverance, became sources of morale. Strength grew not from dramatic action, but from repeated, intentional effort, a lesson in patience that resonated deeply within the army. Camaraderie softened the harshness of the winter. Soldiers shared stories by firelight, recounted experiences from home, and supported one another in ways both practical and emotional. Humor and companionship persisted in hushed tones, offering relief from monotony and hardship. Listeners can imagine the quiet conversations, the faint laughter, and the small acts of kindness that carried the weight of morale through long, silent nights. These human moments shaped the resilience of the army as much as training or strategy. Routine became essential for endurance. Daily tasks, repairing tents, tending fires, gathering firewood, created rhythm and purpose, structuring time against the monotony of cold, white landscapes. Even simple chores were imbued with significance, reinforcing discipline and contributing to the survival of the whole. The narration emphasizes these repeated, measured actions, allowing listeners to absorb the reality of endurance and reflection without alarm. The emotional landscape of Valley Forge was complex. Soldiers confronted fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion, yet also experienced moments of pride, hope, and quiet determination. Victory was not measured in battles won, but in survival, adaptation, and incremental improvement. Listeners are invited to inhabit this space, sensing both the challenges and the quiet triumphs that emerge when patience and perseverance are tested to their limits. Letters and reports circulated in the camp, carrying encouragement from leaders and families alike. Each note reminded soldiers that their struggle was part of a larger story, that their endurance contributed to a cause beyond immediate suffering. Reflection became as important as action. Understanding the significance of hardship offered strength and purpose amid the biting cold. By the end of winter, the soldiers of Valley Forge had transformed through experience. The army that had arrived as scattered and inexperienced now carried the marks of endurance, discipline, and subtle confidence. Small victories, each drill, each shared meal, each act of care, had accumulated into a quiet, profound power. The revolution was progressing not only through strategy and alliances, but through the steadfast human spirit tested and honed in stillness. Listeners, guided by calm narration, feel the rhythm of this endurance. Strength, patience, and camaraderie emerge as powerful forces, demonstrating that growth often occurs in quiet, reflective spaces rather than in moments of spectacle. Valley Forge becomes more than a campsite. It is a testament to human resilience, patience, and the subtle ways in which courage and determination shape history. Amid the biting cold and relentless routine of Valley Forge, a subtle transformation began to take shape. The Continental Army, once a collection of inexperienced militias and local volunteers, slowly evolved into a disciplined and cohesive force. The change was not immediate or dramatic, but cumulative, shaped by patient instruction, repeated practice, and the steady hand of leadership that valued learning and coordination above impulse or bravado. General George Washington moved among the men with quiet purpose. His presence was steady, measured, and encouraging. He understood the fragility of morale and the importance of small successes, and he guided the army with patience rather than force. Soldiers watched him listen carefully to officers, offer gentle corrections, and walk among the ranks, reinforcing order and confidence. Each interaction was deliberate, demonstrating that leadership could inspire without loud proclamation or intimidation, a lesson in the subtle power of guidance. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer with experience in European warfare, introduced structured training that emphasized clarity, repetition, and precision. Drills were repeated until movements became instinctive. Soldiers learned to load and fire muskets with efficiency, execute formations with coordinated steps, and respond to commands with uniform timing. The focus was not on the drama of battle, but on the mastery of process. Listeners can imagine the rhythmic sound of footsteps across frozen ground, the faint commands carried on cold morning air, and the gradual perfection of action through repetition. Even minor tasks were imbued with significance. Cleaning and maintaining weapons, tending to camp arrangements, and practicing communication all contributed to the Army's overall effectiveness. Each soldier, through diligence and attention, became part of a larger organism, learning that their individual actions could influence collective success. The narrative emphasizes these incremental achievements, allowing listeners to absorb the sense of purpose and quiet accomplishment that grew steadily within the ranks. Training also fostered confidence. Men who had arrived at Valley Forge uncertain of their abilities discovered skill, strength, and resilience within themselves. Mistakes were met with instruction rather than scorn. Progress was measured patiently, and encouragement reinforced learning. Confidence emerged not from sudden victories, but from the accumulation of competence and understanding, a rhythm that the audience can follow at a gentle pace. Beyond technical skill, the process nurtured camaraderie and trust. Soldiers depended on one another during drills, learning to anticipate movements and respond as a unit. Mutual reliance strengthened bonds, creating a sense of shared purpose that extended beyond individual capability. Listeners are invited to feel this quiet cohesion, appreciating the way human connection amplifies strength without the need for overt conflict or spectacle. The psychological aspect of training was as important as the physical. Routine and structure offered stability amid uncertainty, reducing anxiety and instilling a sense of progress. Soldiers learned to trust not only their own abilities, but also the judgment and guidance of their leaders. Reflection and observation became integral to development, allowing men to internalize lessons slowly and thoughtfully. The audience experiences this as a gentle, immersive process, absorbing growth without tension or alarm. Washington's leadership exemplified the balance between authority and encouragement. He emphasized that mistakes were part of learning, and that perseverance mattered as much as precision. Soldiers responded to this approach with steady improvement, internalizing discipline while maintaining morale. The transformation of the army unfolded quietly but persistently, a testament to the effectiveness of deliberate guidance and patient effort. Through repeated practice, careful instruction, and mutual reliance, the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge not merely as a collection of men, but as a transformed force. Discipline, skill, and confidence had grown in tandem, providing the foundation for future engagements. The revolution advanced through preparation, patience, and reflection, proving that readiness itself could be a form of heroism. Listeners, guided by calm narration, witnessed the unfolding of transformation as a slow, absorbing progression. Training at Valley Forge illustrates that enduring strength often arises from process rather than spectacle, from guidance rather than command, and from persistent effort rather than dramatic action. It is a story of quiet growth, resilience, and the shaping of destiny through careful, intentional preparation. In the quiet evenings of Valley Forge, after the day's drills and routines had settled into fatigue, soldiers reached for small comforts, letters from home, messages carefully carried across snow-blanketed roads, and notes that bridged the miles between family and camp. Each letter was more than ink on paper. It was a lifeline, a tangible connection to a world that persisted beyond frost-covered fields and the uncertain rhythm of war. Listeners are invited into this intimate space, sensing the quiet heartbeat of human connection amid endurance and challenge. Letters traveled slowly, often over weeks or months, through messengers, neighboring settlements, and weary roads. Soldiers awaited them with anticipation, sometimes holding a letter in hand for hours before reading aloud to comrades. The contents were simple yet profound. Inquiries about well-being, small stories of daily life, advice on tending the farm or shop, and expressions of love and reassurance. Each word carried meaning, bridging the physical distance with emotional closeness and offering comfort amid the cold and the uncertainty of the campaign. From the home front, families wrote with careful thought, balancing hope and concern. Parents described chores and routines, siblings shared minor achievements, and spouses expressed longing without despair. Each letter was crafted to reassure, to maintain strength, and to provide glimpses of continuity in life beyond the encampment. The narrative emphasizes these delicate details, guiding listeners through the subtle emotional landscape that ordinary correspondence created during extraordinary times. Soldiers often responded in turn, their letters conveying updates, reflections, and small victories. They described the progress of drills, the rhythms of camp life, and the camaraderie that sustained them. Even in recounting hardships, the cold, the hunger, the challenges of discipline, letters carried optimism, humor, or philosophical observation. Through these exchanges, soldiers maintained morale not only for themselves, but also for their families, reinforcing bonds and providing reassurance that the struggle, though difficult, was shared and understood. The act of writing and reading letters created pauses in the relentless pace of military life. In these quiet moments, men reflected on what they were fighting for: the preservation of home, the protection of loved ones, and the hope for a future shaped by freedom. Listeners are drawn into the intimacy of these reflections, sensing the power of small acts of communication to sustain courage and purpose. Each envelope, each folded page, became a conduit for hope and emotional resilience. Even routine updates could carry profound meaning. A report of a neighbor's health, a note about the harvest, or a story of a child learning to read reminded soldiers of continuity and life beyond the encampment. These details, seemingly minor, reinforced the value of endurance and patience, highlighting that human experience persisted amid the vast sweep of history. The audience is guided gently, experiencing the intertwining of personal and historical narrative as a source of calm engagement. Letters also conveyed collective experiences. Soldiers shared anecdotes about camp life, observations about drills, or reflections on the weather and terrain. Families offered encouragement, advice, and sometimes humor, creating a shared narrative that strengthened community bonds even across distance. The repetition of correspondence, the anticipation of arrival, and the careful reading aloud nurtured both patience and reflection, reinforcing the rhythm of life within the extraordinary circumstances of war. The emotional resonance of these exchanges was subtle but enduring. Hope emerged quietly, interwoven with concern and longing. Anxiety was acknowledged yet tempered with reassurance. Resilience grew in small increments, nurtured by the constancy of communication and the knowledge that bonds remained intact. Listeners experienced this as a gentle emotional arc, allowing empathy and connection to flourish without urgency or alarm. Through letters, the human dimension of the revolution becomes vivid. Strategy, tactics, and battles exist alongside tender, personal narratives. The audience is invited to feel both the individual and collective stakes, understanding that the endurance of the army relied as much on emotional connection as on skill or leadership. In this way, correspondence bridges private life and public history, illuminating the quiet persistence that underpins grand events. By winter's end, the letters had accumulated into a tapestry of experience. Joy, concern, hope, humor, and reflection interwoven with the shared journey of revolution. Soldiers and families were linked across space and time, their words reinforcing patience, perseverance, and understanding. For listeners, these moments provide a calm, immersive perspective on history, highlighting the strength of human connection and the quiet power of empathy. The revolution is experienced not only through strategy or conflict, but through the tender, enduring presence of words exchanged across distance, sustaining courage and resilience in both writer and reader. As winter loosened its grip on the colonies, the Continental Army began to experience the subtle power of strategic victories. These were not sudden, overwhelming triumphs, but carefully measured successes that shifted momentum and fostered hope. At Trenton, for instance, the quiet determination of soldiers navigating icy roads and frozen rivers set the stage for an unexpected advantage. Listeners are invited to imagine the mist rising over the Delaware River, the soft crunch of footsteps on ice, and the deliberate coordination that preceded the engagement. Every move was precise, each choice weighed for maximum effect. The surprise at Trenton was a lesson in planning and patience. Soldiers crossed in darkness, guided by careful observation and knowledge of the terrain. The enemy, unprepared for this silent advance, found themselves facing an organized force that had leveraged discipline, timing, and strategy to create opportunity. The result was a small yet meaningful victory, enough to lift spirits, instill confidence, and demonstrate that careful thought could produce tangible results. For late-night listeners, the drama lies not in noise or chaos, but in the quiet triumph of preparation and execution. Saratoga, months later, offered another illustration of momentum shifting through strategy and resilience. The Continental Army, reinforced by careful planning and the growing experience of soldiers, engaged in a series of maneuvers that constrained the British forces. Weather, terrain, and observation all played critical roles. Hills were surveyed for advantage, forests used for cover, and river crossings timed for minimal risk. Each step was deliberate, each decision informed by the lessons of prior hardship. Listeners can follow this rhythm, sensing the subtle escalation of stakes without sudden alarm. The significance of these victories extended beyond immediate tactical gains. At Trenton, the Army's morale improved dramatically. Small triumphs became symbols of endurance, courage, and the effectiveness of training and leadership. Soldiers carried a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that their careful planning and quiet perseverance could yield measurable results. At Saratoga, the capture of key British forces demonstrated that coordination, observation, and patience could change the trajectory of the conflict. The audience senses the slow accumulation of confidence, hope, and momentum, a progression that feels both satisfying and calming. Atmosphere and environment shape the narrative as much as action. Frost-laden fields, fog-cloaked rivers, and dense forests framed each engagement, offering opportunities for strategy and concealment. These elements created suspense that is reflective rather than alarming, allowing listeners to experience tension through observation and anticipation rather than chaos. The natural world became an ally and a factor, reminding audiences that history unfolds within layers of context and circumstance. Leadership again played a quiet yet decisive role. Washington and his officers guided movements with precision, weighing intelligence reports, terrain observations, and troop readiness before acting. Decisions were measured and deliberate, reinforcing the notion that control and foresight can create opportunities even when resources are limited. Listeners are drawn into this careful orchestration, experiencing the satisfaction of strategic thought executed successfully. Small actions within these battles carried larger consequences. A coordinated flanking maneuver, the timing of reinforcements, or the placement of artillery could alter outcomes without requiring dramatic spectacle. Each calculated choice contributed to the growing narrative of hope and capability. The audience senses that victories, though modest in appearance, ripple outward, influencing morale, alliances, and the broader momentum of the revolution. The emotional impact of Trenton and Saratoga is subtle yet profound. Soldiers, once demoralized by frost, hunger, and prior setbacks, discovered the power of perseverance and preparation. Civilians learned that resilience and planning could produce change even in uncertain times. Listeners experience a gentle arc of encouragement. Hope emerges quietly, strengthens gradually, and prepares the mind for the larger challenges yet to come. Through these engagements, the revolution demonstrates that progress often arrives in measured steps rather than grand, overwhelming moments. Listeners can feel the rhythm of change, the accumulation of small victories, and the quiet confidence that follows disciplined effort. Trenton and Saratoga exemplify the way patience, planning, and careful observation can shift momentum, providing satisfaction and anticipation without disturbing calm. In reflecting on these battles, it becomes clear that heroism is not always loud. Quiet courage, thoughtful coordination, and measured action have the power to alter history, building hope and momentum in subtle, enduring ways. For late-night listeners, the story offers engagement, reflection, and reassurance, reinforcing that even small successes can echo across time and shape outcomes profoundly. As the revolution progressed, the importance of international support became increasingly clear. While victories on the battlefield provided morale and momentum, the fledgling Continental Army relied on external resources, recognition, and expertise to sustain the struggle. Among potential allies, France stood out, not merely as a source of material aid, but as a partner whose formal alliance could reshape the strategic landscape. The process of cultivating this relationship unfolded through careful correspondence, patient negotiation, and deliberate timing, a subtle dance of diplomacy that extended the revolution beyond the immediate fields of conflict. French officials, initially cautious, observed the progression of the colonies' efforts with interest. Letters, emissaries, and reports conveyed both the grievances of the Americans and the principles underlying their quest for independence. Envoys presented arguments framed with precision, emphasizing shared philosophical ideals, mutual benefit, and the practical advantages of intervention. For listeners, the narrative evokes the quiet intensity of this intellectual and strategic exchange. Patience, persuasion, and attention to detail became as powerful as muskets and cannons. Negotiation was layered with subtlety. French diplomats weighed the potential risks of open involvement against the promise of weakening a historical rival in Britain. Every letter, meeting, and verbal exchange was carefully considered, with couriers ensuring that messages arrived intact and without delay. The audience is guided gently through this process, experiencing the suspense inherent in slow-moving, consequential communication rather than in direct confrontation. Each response carried meaning, signaling either encouragement or hesitation, and shaping the next steps in a campaign of trust and calculated influence. The alliance, when it was formally confirmed, marked a pivotal expansion of the revolution. French support provided funding, supplies, and access to trained military advisors, all of which strengthened the American position. Ships carrying weapons, uniforms, and provisions arrived with steady reliability, easing shortages and boosting morale. Yet the significance of this partnership extended beyond material assistance. It represented international recognition of the colonies' legitimacy, a symbolic confirmation that their cause resonated across oceans. Listeners can appreciate the quiet weight of this acknowledgement, understanding that the flow of support was as much psychological as it was practical. Correspondence remained central to sustaining trust and coordination. Letters crossed the Atlantic with regularity, each one crafted to convey careful thought, gratitude, and strategic insight. Leaders in the colonies were mindful of tone, timing, and clarity, ensuring that messages reinforced reliability and credibility. Envoys and diplomats monitored responses, interpreting nuance and adjusting their approach to maintain momentum. The audience experiences this careful, measured process as a rhythm of intrigue and planning, gentle yet compelling in its significance. The formal alliance also required coordination between military and diplomatic efforts. American generals adapted strategies to incorporate incoming resources, planning movements with the knowledge that reinforcement was imminent. French advisors trained troops, shared knowledge of artillery and tactics, and advised on logistics, all without disrupting the steady, reflective rhythm of daily life in camp. Listeners sense the integration of multiple layers of strategy, from the local battlefield to the international stage, emphasizing foresight and coordination over chaos. Even the political implications were navigated with care. France's involvement encouraged other nations to observe, consider, and in some cases provide support indirectly. Each diplomatic success increased the colonies' leverage, allowing leaders to negotiate and plan with a greater sense of confidence. The revolution expanded quietly, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of trust, credibility, and subtle influence. For late-night listeners, the experience is immersive. The stakes are high, yet the narration remains calm, measured, and reflective. The human dimension of these interactions is also evident. Envoys and diplomats worked tirelessly, often in isolation, balancing hope, caution, and principle. Their success relied on careful judgment, patience, and the ability to read the intentions of others. Listeners are invited into this thoughtful process, appreciating the quiet heroism of negotiation, correspondence, and strategic foresight. Through these developments, the audience perceives a broader sense of the revolution's trajectory. The war is no longer confined to the colonies. It is part of a network of international relationships, shaped by diplomacy as much as by the clash of armies. Small actions, letters written, alliances proposed, timing considered, carry significant weight, demonstrating that influence and trust can traverse oceans and impact the course of history profoundly. By the end of this phase, French support had become both tangible and symbolic. Soldiers felt the bolstering presence of resources and expertise, while leaders recognized the expanded possibilities that a reliable ally provided. Listeners are left with a sense of quiet anticipation, understanding that preparation, trust, and careful coordination are as crucial to success as courage and strategy, setting the stage for the turning points to come in the revolution. History often remembers grand battles and sweeping victories, yet the revolution was also shaped by countless small, almost invisible acts of courage. These were moments of bravery that unfolded quietly, unnoticed by crowds, unheralded in newspapers, but no less significant in their impact. Soldiers, messengers, spies, and ordinary citizens performed tasks that required persistence, judgment, and moral courage, each contributing to the larger cause in ways that were subtle yet powerful. For late-night listeners, these stories provide calm inspiration, a reminder that heroism is not always loud. Consider the spies who moved silently through towns and villages, carrying vital intelligence from one post to another. Each message could shift strategy, prevent disaster, or save lives. They traveled cautiously, blending into crowds, speaking only when necessary, and concealing their purpose beneath ordinary appearances. Every decision carried risk, yet the quiet vigilance and discretion of these individuals often shaped outcomes more than visible engagements on the battlefield. The audience experiences suspense that is reflective rather than alarming, appreciating the tension that arises from responsibility and skill rather than spectacle. Messengers, too, played a critical role in sustaining the revolution's momentum. Traversing long distances through forests, over rivers, and across snow-covered roads, they ensured that orders, updates, and letters reached their destinations intact. They encountered hazards not in direct combat, but in the unpredictability of travel, weather, and observation by enemies. The courage inherent in these journeys was understated, grounded in the discipline to perform necessary tasks despite discomfort or danger. Listeners can imagine the rhythmic passage of hooves along frozen paths, the careful hiding of messages, and the sense of purpose guiding each step. Ordinary participants, farmers, merchants, and townspeople, also contributed in quiet ways that required bravery of a different sort. They sheltered soldiers, supplied provisions, or offered information that could influence strategic decisions. Often these actions carried risk of retaliation or social consequence, yet they persisted out of conviction and a sense of responsibility. The narration emphasizes the human scale of these contributions, allowing listeners to absorb the emotional significance without escalating tension. These moments reveal heroism in patience, moral choice, and steadfastness rather than in dramatic gestures. Even within the army, quiet heroism flourished. Soldiers enduring frost, hunger, and illness at camps like Valley Forge demonstrated resilience in the face of relentless difficulty. Each act of cooperation, helping a comrade, sharing rations, or tending to the wounded, embodied courage that was intimate, deliberate, and reflective. For listeners, these instances cultivate empathy and admiration, creating engagement grounded in shared human experience rather than spectacle. Women also contributed heroically, often behind the scenes. They managed homes and farms in the absence of men, cared for children, and provided logistical support for the army. Their contributions, while frequently unrecorded in official accounts, were essential to sustaining communities and the broader revolutionary effort. Letters and diaries reveal their quiet determination, endurance, and creative problem-solving, illustrating that heroism extends beyond the battlefield into the rhythm of daily life. Moral courage, 2, defined quiet heroism. Individuals made choices guided by principle rather than self-interest, whether risking punishment to act ethically, speaking truth to authority, or preserving integrity in trying circumstances. The impact of such decisions was cumulative, shaping trust, morale, and strategy. For the audience, this provides reflective engagement, emphasizing that courage and influence often arise from deliberate, thoughtful action rather than spectacle or conflict. These small acts collectively contributed to a network of resilience that strengthened the revolutionary effort. Each thread, whether a message delivered, a neighbor aided, or a moral choice upheld, wove into a fabric of persistence, determination, and hope. The revolution's success relied as much on these intimate contributions as on large-scale military maneuvers, illustrating that quiet heroism sustains momentum and shapes outcomes in profound ways. Listeners are invited to imagine the personal experience of these actors, the silent observation, the careful decision-making, and the disciplined execution of tasks. The suspense is internal, the stakes ethical and practical rather than explosive. This immersive perspective highlights the human dimension of history, drawing emotional engagement through reflection and understanding. By focusing on these quieter narratives, the audience gains a richer appreciation for the complexity and humanity of the revolution. Heroism is redefined not as spectacle, but as steadfastness, moral courage, and subtle influence. Each story reinforces the continuity of the historical arc, linking individual experience to broader events without disturbing the calm, immersive rhythm that guides listeners toward reflection and rest. Through spies, messengers, soldiers, and everyday citizens, quiet acts of heroism demonstrate that even small, unseen contributions can shape history. Listeners are left with a sense of calm inspiration, understanding that courage resides in persistence, patience, and principle. This section bridges the human element with larger outcomes, preparing the audience for the reflective conclusions and celebration that follow. The autumn of 1781 brought the Continental Army and its French allies to the Virginia countryside, where a decisive moment awaited. The siege of Yorktown was not marked by the chaos of continuous battle, but by careful planning, coordination, and patience. The army surrounded the British forces with deliberate precision, constructing fortifications, observing enemy positions, and coordinating movements across both land and sea. Listeners are invited to imagine the soft hum of activity, the creaking of wheels, the measured steps of soldiers, and the rustle of tents and encampments under a crisp autumn sky. Strategy dominated the days more than combat. Leaders from both sides assessed terrain, supply lines, and timing, calculating options with care. The Americans, guided by experience gained through years of training and hardship, approached each movement with restraint, ensuring that every action reinforced the larger goal. French allies contributed expertise, their ships positioned to block escape or reinforcement, while artillery placements gradually constrained the British positions. Each adjustment, each inspection was deliberate and measured, creating an atmosphere of controlled anticipation rather than sudden alarm. The British, aware of the encirclement, faced growing pressure that was psychological as much as tactical. The slowly tightening net around Yorktown created a sense of inevitability, though the resolution was not immediate. Listeners can feel the tension through observation and patience, rather than through dramatized violence. The siege demonstrates that history can turn decisively in quiet, structured ways, where patience and coordination replace spectacle. Troops endured long days of preparation, digging trenches, reinforcing lines, and sharing information across units. The rhythm of work created a reflective pace, emphasizing endurance, discipline, and collective effort. Every contribution mattered, whether carrying supplies, tending artillery, or relaying messages. For the audience, the narrative highlights how careful orchestration, rather than chaos, brought the conflict to its conclusion, underscoring the power of planning and human diligence. The culmination of these efforts was gradual yet profound. British surrender at Yorktown was not accompanied by sudden, sweeping celebration, but by the recognition of months of careful strategy coming to fruition. Soldiers, officers, and allies experienced relief and quiet satisfaction, understanding that perseverance, coordination, and patience had delivered success. Listeners can feel this resolution gently, appreciating the emotional and historical weight of the moment without the need for dramatic peaks. Correspondence and reports traveled swiftly to inform leaders elsewhere of the unfolding outcome. The surrender resonated across the colonies and abroad, confirming the effectiveness of alliances, strategic planning, and human resolve. Civilians, too, absorbed the news with calm reflection, sensing that a long struggle was approaching closure, and that daily life could gradually resume in a transformed landscape. The emotional impact of Yorktown was subtle but enduring. Hope, relief, and quiet triumph intertwined, marking the end of a prolonged journey. Soldiers and citizens alike recognized the significance of the achievement, understanding that victory was the product of sustained effort, collaboration, and disciplined endurance. The audience experiences this as a gentle climax. History resolves through thoughtful action rather than spectacle, providing satisfaction without overstimulation. Even in the final days, leadership and human connection remained central. Officers guided retreating or surrendering forces with care, ensuring order and minimizing unnecessary risk. Civilians and support personnel contributed to logistics, reinforcing that the revolution's success depended on both strategy and everyday commitment. Listeners are invited to appreciate these layers, sensing the quiet orchestration behind a monumental outcome. The Siege of Yorktown, in its calm but decisive unfolding, illustrates that endings can be both monumental and restrained. Momentum, patience, and collaboration converged to bring the revolution to a close. For late-night listeners, the narrative offers closure without agitation, reinforcing the cumulative power of endurance, planning, and human effort across years of struggle. As the British raised the white flag, the audience is left with a sense of gentle resolution. The war's final chapter emphasizes thoughtfulness, persistence, and quiet heroism. History concludes not with clamor, but with measured relief, leaving listeners immersed in a reflective, satisfying sense of accomplishment and closure. The echoes of years of strategy, resilience, and patience lingering softly in mind and imagination. With the guns silenced at Yorktown, the revolution shifted from the fields of battle to the quiet chambers of negotiation. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formalized what years of struggle had made possible: recognition of American independence. Yet this was not a moment of sudden celebration or dramatic confrontation. It unfolded through patient diplomacy, careful wording, and deliberate human decisions, each step requiring reflection, compromise, and foresight. Listeners are invited to witness history as it is shaped through conversation, ink, and thought rather than spectacle. Negotiators from both sides approached the discussions with measured attention. American representatives, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, worked tirelessly to articulate the colony's goals and protect the interests of a fledgling nation. Across the table, British diplomats balanced pride, practicality, and the realities of defeat. Each clause, phrase, and comma carried weight, with the potential to shape borders, governance, and international relations for generations. The audience senses the quiet tension of these careful choices, understanding that influence often lies in subtle negotiation rather than force. Letters and drafts traveled between capitals, conveying proposals, counterproposals, and clarifications. Each iteration refined language and intention, ensuring that agreements were precise, enforceable, and fair. The process demanded patience and attention to detail, as even minor wording could have significant consequences for trade, territorial claims, and political recognition. Listeners are drawn into the rhythm of deliberation, absorbing the gravity of decision-making in a calm, reflective manner. The treaty itself addressed multiple aspects of independence: recognition of American sovereignty, delineation of borders, rights of citizens, and arrangements for debts and property. Each provision was the result of careful dialogue, compromise, and foresight. The narrative emphasizes human judgment, illustrating how patience, intellect, and principled negotiation can resolve complex issues without recourse to confrontation. For late-night listeners, this approach fosters immersion and reflection, highlighting the power of thoughtfulness over spectacle. Negotiators also considered the human dimension. Relationships built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding guided interactions. Franklin's diplomacy in Paris, for example, combined wit, charm, and knowledge of European politics, softening tension while advancing strategic aims. Similarly, Adams and Jay navigated competing priorities and delicate social protocols, demonstrating that emotional intelligence was as vital as legal or political acumen. Listeners can appreciate the subtle interplay of character and circumstance, experiencing intrigue and resolution without sudden peaks of excitement. The wider implications of the treaty rippled quietly but profoundly. Recognition by Britain validated the sacrifices and perseverance of years of struggle, confirming that the vision of independence was not merely aspirational, but achievable. International observers took note, setting the stage for future alliances, trade, and diplomacy. In this calm, methodical unfolding, the audience senses that nations are shaped as much by careful words and agreements as by military action. Even the ratification process was conducted with deliberation. States reviewed the treaty, discussed implications, and ensured that ratification reflected consensus and clarity. Citizens learned of the agreement gradually, absorbing its significance through newspapers, letters, and public readings. The narrative highlights the patient, communal understanding of independence, allowing listeners to experience the historical weight through reflection and context rather than drama. The Treaty of Paris also illustrates the subtle power of foresight. By attending to detail, anticipating challenges, and negotiating patiently, the negotiators secured not only immediate recognition, but a foundation for governance, trade, and international standing. Listeners are guided to appreciate that the end of war is not simply the cessation of violence, but the careful construction of lasting stability through human judgment and cooperation. Through this slow, deliberate process, freedom was formalized not with noise or spectacle, but through reasoned agreement and thoughtful decision-making. The audience witnesses how words on paper, chosen with care and attention, can secure liberty, define boundaries, and reshape nations. The narration emphasizes reflection, allowing the weight of these moments to settle gently into the listener's mind, providing satisfaction and closure without sudden intensity. By the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris, the American Revolution had moved from battlefield to boardroom, from endurance to affirmation. Listeners experience a calm, thoughtful resolution, understanding that the struggle's end was as much a triumph of patience, negotiation, and human insight as it was of courage and perseverance. The story closes with a sense of quiet accomplishment, the echo of careful, deliberate choices lingering softly as the nation began its journey into independence. With the Treaty of Paris signed and independence secured, the former colonies began the delicate process of imagining themselves as a single nation. The transition was quiet, almost meditative, as people moved from the immediacy of struggle to the reflection required to define shared purpose and civic responsibility. For listeners, this moment offers calm introspection, guiding the mind to consider how freedom, once achieved, is nurtured through thought, collaboration, and subtle daily choices rather than through continued conflict. Communities across the new United States began to explore what self-governance truly meant. Town meetings, local councils, and informal discussions allowed citizens to weigh questions of law, ethics, and social responsibility. These moments were not marked by noise or spectacle, but by careful conversation, listening, and reasoning. Residents learned that freedom carried obligations, fairness, participation, and attention to the collective well-being. Listeners can imagine quiet streets, homes lit by oil lamps, and voices carrying through small chambers as ideas for governance took root, fostering a sense of calm curiosity about the formation of society. Philosophical reflection became a natural companion to practical decisions. Thinkers considered principles of justice, individual rights, and the role of government in balancing authority and liberty. Ordinary citizens, too, engaged with these concepts, discussing what it meant to live under a nation they had helped create. This contemplative atmosphere allows listeners to absorb the emotional and intellectual significance of independence without urgency, emphasizing thoughtful engagement over sensationalism. Symbols and rituals reinforced emerging identity. Flags, seals, public readings, and commemorations provided tangible reminders of shared purpose and history. These acts, though subtle, helped cultivate unity and a sense of belonging. Listening to these stories late at night, one can sense the quiet reassurance that collective identity grows from repeated, deliberate actions, creating cohesion without fanfare. Each gesture, each observance, became a thread in the fabric of a nation learning to be itself. Leadership continued to guide this formative period. Figures like George Washington, now a symbol of steady resolve, exemplified the balance of authority and humility necessary for a nation finding its footing. Decision-making involved consultation, patience, and reflection, modeling behavior for citizens and illustrating that governance required more than ambition. It demanded thoughtfulness, empathy, and responsibility. Listeners are drawn into this rhythm, feeling the calm progression of society learning to function through reason and care. Education, civic engagement, and the sharing of ideas became central to shaping identity. Newspapers, pamphlets, and informal gatherings encouraged discussion, reflection, and understanding of shared principles. Citizens learned to reconcile regional differences, economic disparities, and varying local traditions into a broader sense of national coherence. For late-night listeners, these processes unfold in a measured, absorbing cadence, emphasizing intellectual and moral development rather than spectacle or drama. Reflection on history itself also shaped identity. People considered the sacrifices, perseverance, and quiet heroism that had brought independence. Memories of endurance at Valley Forge, the strategic patience at Yorktown, and the careful diplomacy of Paris reminded citizens that freedom was neither instantaneous nor inevitable. It was cultivated through sustained effort and thoughtful choices. Listeners can feel a gentle reverence for the past, understanding that collective experience forms the foundation for present and future action. Shared values and civic responsibility emerged as guiding principles. Respect for law, commitment to community, and attention to mutual well-being became markers of identity, as citizens recognized that liberty required care and engagement. These reflections were intimate and continuous, unfolding quietly in homes, public spaces, and private thought. The audience absorbs the significance gradually, appreciating the depth and complexity of societal formation without urgency or tension. Through these reflective moments, the nation's character took shape. Identity was less about declarations or flags and more about the interplay of thought, responsibility, and deliberate action. Listeners are encouraged to experience the calm unfolding of civic consciousness, where freedom is not only a condition but a cultivated practice, nurtured through reflection and daily participation. By the close of this narrative, the story emphasizes that history continues in subtle, thoughtful ways. Independence was achieved, but the shaping of identity, values, and civic life requires ongoing reflection. The audience is left with a sense of satisfaction, calm contemplation, and connection to both the struggles and the quiet triumphs that define the emergence of a nation. Freedom, like this narration, is experienced slowly, deeply, and with enduring resonance. The cannons had fallen silent, the flags of independence proudly displayed, and yet the arrival of peace carried with it a quiet uncertainty. For years, the colonies had defined themselves by struggle, by the rhythm of training, the coordination of battles, and the suspense of negotiation. Now, with the revolution concluded, a different kind of challenge emerged, learning to exist in freedom without the familiar cadence of conflict. Listeners are invited to feel the subtle tension of this transition, a calm curiosity about what life truly means when the immediate threat has vanished. Streets and towns seemed both familiar and transformed. Families returned from displacement, soldiers from long encampments, and merchants reopened shops that had long been shuttered. Yet the air carried a strange stillness, a sense of newness that was both hopeful and disorienting. Citizens moved carefully, weighing choices and responsibilities that had previously been determined by circumstance. The audience senses the delicate shift from action to contemplation, experiencing the slow rhythm of a society awakening to self-governance. Daily routines were redefined in the absence of war. Farmers tended fields without worry of raids, artisans pursued work unimpeded by troop movements, and children grew in an environment gradually shedding the shadow of conflict. Yet even in these quiet activities, responsibility weighed heavily. Freedom brought questions: how to govern fairly, how to ensure justice, how to create structures that would endure. Listeners are guided through these reflective moments, sensing the weight of decision-making in the stillness that follows struggle. Leaders faced challenges they had never encountered in the heat of battle. Figures like George Washington and other statesmen turned their attention to political, legal, and social frameworks. Decisions now involved balance and foresight, not immediate action or survival. Assemblies met to draft constitutions, define laws, and establish the foundations of governance. Every choice carried consequence, and listeners feel the careful deliberation required, the kind of thoughtful pacing that invites calm engagement and introspection. Civilians, too, experienced an inner adjustment. The exhilaration of victory gradually gave way to reflection and contemplation. People evaluated their place in this new nation, considering both personal freedom and collective responsibility. Communities held meetings, discussions, and local councils, learning that democracy was not inherited. It was built slowly, through conversation, compromise, and patience. For late-night listeners, this provides gentle curiosity and emotional grounding, illustrating that history continues quietly after dramatic events conclude. The economy required careful attention. Trade routes, supply chains, and local markets needed restoration and innovation. Merchants balanced optimism with caution, and farmers navigated both opportunity and uncertainty. Daily life became a careful dance, where ordinary decisions carried the weight of sustaining independence. The audience can absorb this as a rhythmic unfolding, imagining the steady pulse of life resuming while society recalibrates itself. Even culture and identity were in flux. Songs, stories, and celebrations commemorated the struggle, embedding memory and reflection into everyday life. Yet these expressions were subtle, intimate, and measured rather than ostentatious. Through them, citizens processed the past, honored sacrifice, and reinforced shared values. Listeners are drawn into the texture of this human experience, sensing continuity and connection as essential elements of nation building. Emotional adjustment was also gradual. Relief intertwined with uncertainty, hope mingled with caution. Families reconnected slowly, soldiers reoriented themselves to civilian life, and leaders contemplated the delicate balance of liberty and order. The audience experiences this duality as a gentle ebb and flow of reflection, absorbing both the calm and the lingering tension that accompanies profound change. In these early days of peace, the nation learned that independence was not an endpoint but a beginning. Structures, values, and shared understanding required cultivation, patience, and careful attention. Listeners are guided through the nuances of this awakening, feeling the calm rhythm of society finding its footing and the subtle anticipation of what the future might hold. By the close of this section, the audience senses the quiet emergence of a new order, a nation and its people awakening to freedom, responsibility, and self-determination. Story encourages reflection, gentle curiosity, and emotional closure, preparing listeners to experience the concluding chapters with calm satisfaction and thoughtful resonance. Victory carries a gentle satisfaction, yet beneath its calm surface lies the quiet weight of sacrifice. The American Revolution, for all its ideals and triumphs, exacted a toll measured not just in lives, but in transformed landscapes, disrupted communities, and the testing of principles that had once seemed abstract. For late-night listeners, this section provides reflective depth, inviting contemplation without overwhelming emotion, balancing historical realism with soothing narration. Every battlefield bore witness to human loss. Soldiers succumbed to wounds, disease, and exhaustion. Their absence was felt in homes, villages, and towns across the 13 states. Families adjusted, taking on responsibilities that once fell to fathers, sons, or brothers. Listeners are guided gently through these personal stories, imagining the quiet grief and resilience that permeated daily life. This is not a dramatization of violence, but a reflective acknowledgement of sacrifice, allowing empathy to unfold calmly and naturally. Communities themselves were reshaped. Fields that once yielded harvest were sometimes scarred by movement of troops or military encampments. Towns adjusted to the presence of returning soldiers, shortages, and the slow rebuilding of commerce. Everyday life was interrupted, and ordinary routines required patient adaptation. The narration emphasizes human endurance and continuity, allowing listeners to absorb the magnitude of change through reflection rather than alarm. Ideals, too, were tested. Liberty, equality, and justice were not automatic outcomes of victory. Leaders and citizens confronted the complexity of transforming philosophical principles into practical governance. Disagreements, compromise, and ethical deliberations became part of the new social fabric. For listeners, this conveys the subtle tension between aspiration and reality, highlighting the mental and moral work required to sustain a nation without creating anxiety or agitation. The emotional landscape of the revolution was varied. Hope, pride, sorrow, and doubt intertwined quietly, shaping the character of individuals and communities. Letters, diaries, and oral accounts preserved these layers, offering insight into the human dimension of change. Listeners can experience these nuances in a soothing rhythm, understanding that progress is both rewarding and demanding, and that reflection is a natural companion to achievement. Economic cost was also significant. Trade had been disrupted, debts incurred, and infrastructure strained. Merchants, farmers, and artisans navigated scarcity while planning for recovery. These adjustments required patience and careful planning, reinforcing that the consequences of revolution extended beyond the battlefield into everyday life. The audience is invited to follow these processes with calm curiosity, appreciating the cumulative impact without feeling overwhelmed. Even cultural and social norms were influenced by the struggle. Roles shifted, relationships evolved, and communities re-examined traditions in light of newfound independence. Listeners sense that the revolution's consequences were lived quietly, in conversations, domestic decisions, and the rhythms of daily labor. Through these subtle transformations, the narrative conveys that the cost of change is pervasive yet experienced gently in ordinary moments. Yet amidst loss and challenge, there were enduring lessons. Courage, perseverance, and moral conviction shaped the new nation's identity. Individuals recognized the value of patience, collaboration, and principled action. These quiet victories of spirit and character complemented tangible successes on the battlefield, allowing listeners to reflect on meaning and consequence without discomfort. The section emphasizes balance. The revolution's cost is acknowledged, yet it is framed within the broader context of resilience and achievement. Pain and sacrifice coexist with hope, creating a nuanced portrait that engages late-night thinkers emotionally while maintaining calm immersion. Listeners are encouraged to consider the weight of history thoughtfully, experiencing the depth of human effort and the echoes of courage that persisted long after the final shots were fired. Ultimately, the cost of the revolution illustrates that freedom is neither easy nor free. It is shaped by human choices, endurance, and sacrifice. By understanding the layers of consequence, the audience gains a deeper appreciation for the accomplishments of the era, absorbing meaning through reflection and gentle contemplation. This section leaves listeners with a sense of solemn respect and measured admiration, bridging naturally toward the final reflections on legacy and identity. The story of the American Revolution does not end with treaties, victories, or independence. It continues to whisper through time, touching the present in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Streets, towns, and institutions carry traces of decisions made centuries ago. For listeners, this section offers a soothing descent into reflection, where history gently fades into daily life, allowing the mind to absorb the weight of events without urgency or stimulation. Monuments, museums, and preserved battlefields serve as quiet reminders of sacrifice and endurance. Yet even beyond physical markers, the revolution lives in ideas, principles of freedom, civic responsibility, and deliberative governance that shape society in ongoing, understated ways. Citizens go about routines unaware of how deeply history informs their choices, yet these echoes persist in law, culture, and civic expectations. Listeners can drift comfortably through this continuum, sensing continuity rather than tension. Language itself preserves the revolution's resonance. Words penned in pamphlets, letters, and official documents continue to influence thought, teaching patience, reasoning, and reflection. The Declaration of Independence, for example, is read not only for its historical significance, but for its enduring philosophy, reminding citizens and listeners alike that freedom and responsibility coexist. The narration allows these ideas to settle gently in the mind, creating both engagement and calm. Society carries invisible patterns shaped by those early decisions. Local governance, political debate, and civic engagement echo the deliberative processes first cultivated in town halls and congresses. Systems of checks and balances, negotiation, and dialogue remain integral to sustaining collective life. Listeners are invited to notice these quiet continuities, realizing that history is not distant. It is lived daily, often without conscious acknowledgement. Cultural memory, too, acts as a bridge between past and present. Stories of heroism, endurance, and moral choice are passed through families, schools, and communities, shaping character and values. They are not always loud or celebrated. Instead, they seep gently into imagination and understanding. The audience experiences this transmission of memory as a calm, reflective current, reinforcing the connection between individual lives and historical continuity. Modern governance, law, and civic expectations subtly embody lessons learned from the revolution. Patience, negotiation, and ethical deliberation continue to guide collective decisions, reminding listeners that the achievements of the past are not frozen in time, but are active frameworks shaping behavior today. The narrative emphasizes process over spectacle, helping the mind relax into awareness without overstimulation. Even ordinary objects carry echoes. Town squares, libraries, and schools exist within landscapes first shaped by citizens seeking self-determination. Names of streets, commemorative events, and shared holidays serve as quiet markers of continuity. Listeners are guided to observe these echoes gently, imagining the layers of history beneath everyday life, fostering a meditative awareness of time and human effort. The revolution's lessons extend beyond governance and civic structures. They touch individual behavior, encouraging reflection, moral courage, and patience. Choices, large and small, are informed by a legacy of perseverance and deliberate thought. By noticing these subtle influences, the audience experiences history as a soft presence, one that informs life without urgency, tension, or distraction. As night deepens, the story invites the mind to drift, carrying with it a sense of continuity, resilience, and quiet admiration. The revolution's echoes are gentle companions to reflection, offering closure not through dramatic imagery or emotional peaks, but through understanding, absorption, and calm acknowledgement of human endeavor across time. Listeners feel the weight of history settle softly, as the present is embraced as a living continuation of past effort and choice. By the end of this reflection, the audience is left in a state of gentle contemplation. The revolution's legacy is complete, yet ongoing, woven seamlessly into the patterns of daily life, thought, and civic engagement. The narrative closes with tranquility, allowing rest to come naturally while maintaining subtle emotional satisfaction and a sense of historical connection.